Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 9th Annual Santa Barbara Botanic Garden Conservation Symposium. Just a couple little housekeeping things. This is a webinar, so only the panelists will be shown and non-muted. So when you have questions to submit, please use the Q&A function. Please also feel free to use the chat if you have comments. Thank you so much to our sponsors, Balance Financial Management and the Barbareño. I'm going to try it this way instead. All right. So here we are at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, where we're the oldest botanic garden in the nation to focus exclusively on native plants. But in addition to being a beautiful place in Santa Barbara, we're at heart a conservation organization, and we've been working this way since 1926. Our mission is to conserve California native plants and habitats for the health and well-being of people and the planet, because native plants are the foundation of the food web and the place where biological diversity starts. So just a couple of words about conservation and research at the garden. I think of the work that we do in this department like the layers of a cake. The first and the base layer is understanding biodiversity. So you have to know what the species are. You have to know how common or how rare they are. You have to know where they're found and what communities they form before you can do anything to conserve them. So we work to understand the plants, the lichens, and even the insects and other invertebrates of the region. Then we have to be sure that we don't lose any of the parts, since every species has a niche and a job to do. Rare plant protection and recovery is the second layer of the cake. First, we work to safeguard against extinction, and then we work to understand the threats that these plants face and what we can do about it. And lastly, we work to recover these species. It's a really long process, and this work takes us farther and farther afield, even this year to far northern California. Lastly, we know it's just not enough to set land aside and hope that it will be okay. Much of our natural lands are degraded, and they've lost the native plant diversity that supports so many of the critical functions that nature does for us. So habitat restoration is the third layer of the cake. We work to restore habitats, and often we study invertebrates to tell us how good of a job we've done. The frosting on the cake is outreach and advocacy, and it may be the most important function of all, because each and every one of us has a role to play. And that's what this symposium is all about. Each year we choose a conservation topic that's important to us, our region, and our community. And we hold a symposium to learn from the best people around the nation and to strategize a way forward. This year, that topic is post-fire habitat restoration, and it could not be timelier since the United Nations report just over a week ago tells us that the risk worldwide of highly devastating fires could increase by up to 57% by the end of the century. We feel that acutely in California since the 5 largest blazes in the state have all occurred since 2018. But we can't forget that at the same time, we're undergoing the 6th mass extinction. We have to be sure that our natural habitats and biological diversity keep functioning. Not only is this diversity beautiful and it's our heritage, but we rely on it for basic things like clean air and water, our food production, and holding our soil together. John C. Pritzloff was a Botanic Garden trustee from 1991 to 2003. He was a lifelong servant and a champion of the people and the environment. He recognized that botanic gardens are really powerful agents for conservation. So individually and collectively, botanic gardens address a range of activities needed to help ensure the survival of threatened plant species. So we choose someone who's made a major conservation impact to be the recipient of the John C. Pritzloff Conservation Award. And past honorees have included the legendary Peter Raven on the left, Clara Kremen, and Jan Semperloff. We're lucky enough that this year our speaker didn't have to travel very far. And this year's award goes to Dr. Carla D'Antonio.
Well, this conservation
Conservation Award is really important to the garden to just honor people that we feel have done so much for active conservation on the ground and all the different aspects of that. And for Carla, she not only has, just stellar science, but also has just been so involved with making sure that translates to conservation happening on the ground.
Going back into the mid-90s, she was already right at the edge between all these different kinds of ecology. So she was doing population ecology, but also community ecology and ecosystem ecology. And she knew so much about the interactions between plants and their environment. That was really groundbreaking at the time and just really exciting and novel.
If you go out in the field with her and her husband, Tom, they're both, first and foremost, people who love natural history. So they'll know all the birds of the area and all the plants of the area. And then she has the ecological theory behind it to ask these really interesting questions.
Everyone's is the most knowledgeable person in the world about their field site. And the question might be, how far away from your field site does your impact extend? So if you frame your questions right, as Carla has done, and if you ask questions that are important enough in those habitats, the lessons that you learn in California or you learn in Hawaii are really quite applicable across global ecosystems. And I think that Carla's impact is certainly extending internationally because of the kinds of powerful questions that he's asked and the powerful ecosystem models that she's used to actually test her questions.
We don't speak about intuition very much in natural sciences, but that's where our hypotheses come from. She's a really good scientist in that she has good intuition for the questions she looks at, and she's able to honestly collect data and say, okay, my intuition was wrong. I admire what she does very much, and she's so smart and she has so much insight that it's always really worth talking to her.
One of the things that I've loved about being in her lab is how much of a family it feels like. She's really good at asking questions and kind of knowing her students too about where our interests are and kind of where our strengths are, and can kind of ask lines of question that kind of get us to our own aha moments.
When I was just an undergrad or a technician, I would talk to her about kind of how I felt. She creates a really warm space to feel comfortable, not just showing her the work that I do accomplish, but really kind of telling her the struggles or what I'm going through. And she very much understands that.
Carla's a lot of fun in the field. When we first started doing our field work in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and we were hiking out on this trail, and I think she had these like boots she had bought in a thrift store or something, and the sole just started coming off, and through the course of the day, like, oh, like, what do we have in our bags? And there might be a little duct tape if we were lucky, but I think it was mostly just like hot pink flagging tape holding this thing together.
Carla's a very funny person. She's easy to talk to. She's relatable. People remember her for a long time. I have a colleague right now in the Forest Service who found out that Carla and I are collaborators, and she said, oh my gosh, my favorite class. 30 years later, her students who were just undergraduates in her class are still reading about her.
She's really open to questioning the dogma. So she'll be that first person who just says, well, what do you think about, like, I've been reading this, and do you really think that that's happening? Or do you really think that's as important as people are making it out to be?
She's a reference. I mean, she will say things that, many people find uncomfortable. But what I find so absolutely wonderful about that is it's against this hyper-liberal, hippie sort of persona background that often doesn't go together with the kind of, caustic sense of humor that I find so absolutely hysterical.
And so she will. She'll come right out and tell you what needs to be improved about something. But that means that when you get a compliment from her, it's really meaningful, and you feel like, okay, I earned that. It is my very great pleasure to introduce the Pritzloff Conservation Awardee, Dr. Carla D'Antonio.
Well, thank you very much for that kind video. That was very fun. I really appreciate it. And of course, thank you for honoring me with this award. Okay, well, thank you all for attending this workshop today, or this conference, whatever you want to call it. And really, I want to recognize all of you for what you do to make the world a better place. It's wonderful to receive an award like this, but it makes me really stop and think, so many people do special things to make the world a better place that everyone deserves a mini award of their own. So thank you all. Okay, moving on. I also want to thank, whoops, I'm having trouble advancing my screen. I want to express my gratitude to the Botanic Garden, of course, for this award, but also because of the things that they are doing regionally in the area of conservation with their focus. Now, Denise presented it as 3 tiers. I didn't know she was going to do that, but I present it this way, that they bring together research, application by working with managers, and education and outreach. And it is these same 3 approaches to doing what I do that characterize the restoration work that I've done and that I'll talk about today. And so I want to first give thanks to the people who have helped me do this, the fund sources that have helped in the research that I'll talk about, the management groups that I have worked with to help hone questions and make sure that our research has applicability, and the dozens of undergraduates and graduate students, postdocs, and other volunteers that I've had the privilege of working with over the years. Many, many interesting and fun colleagues with whom I've had lots of conversations, either about restoration or about wildland fire, who have helped hone my views on this for several decades. And finally, my parents, seen here last year at their 71st wedding anniversary, who instilled in me a love for the sense of discovery that drives the work that I do. And it was my mother who taught me how to plant plants and the excitement of watching them grow. So I'd like to honor them today. Okay, we live on a fire planet, and this image that you see here is a conglomeration of images from 1 year of remote sensing from satellites, showing the radiative power of fire across the globe in the year 2020. And what I want you to notice here is not just the bright spots in Africa, South America, and the Western US, but in fact, the fact that so much of the globe is impacted by wildland fire. And in fact, much of it is impacted directly through direct combustion of organic material from plants and soils, or houses even. But lots of the rest of the world is impacted by the transport of materials released by fire. So often places that are thousands of miles from active burning fronts are heavily affected by atmospheric transport. And fire also contributes to global warming and a feedback loop whereby the carbon that was fixed into plants is released back to the atmosphere, contributing to the greenhouse effect, contributing to fuel aridification and potentially to more fire. So fire is going to continue to have a big impact on our planet through these positive feedback loops. Yet I want to shrink down and think at a local scale, what does fire do? Fire has been an evolutionary force across the globe for millennia. Fire has created all sorts of adaptations of plants to live in places that have fire. But it's not just fire itself, it's fire within the context of a fire regime. And so I want to walk through what a fire regime is with you to help you understand how things are changing on the planet. So when we think of a fire regime, we need to think of a whole variety of different characteristics, such as seasonality. When do the fires occur relative to plant growth or to rainfall? Return interval. Many people think of this as frequency, but it's really the interval of time between fires that plays a role in whether species can evolve and respond to fire or not. The size and continuity of the fire, the intensity and severity, and here I separate these two, with intensity being the heat released by the fire and severity being the impacts on the vegetation. And finally, the type of fire. So some places fires tend to burn in the understory or in the ground layer, and other places in the canopy. And that's what I mean by type of fire. So it's really these fire regimes that differ geographically by climate and location, and that plants are evolved to respond to. So if adaptations to fire regimes are common throughout these fire-prone ecosystems on the globe, why have I asked this question of when and why would we do post-fire restoration? And there are really three reasons I'm going to focus on why post-fire restoration has become essential instead of just letting ecosystems recover on their own. The first is that the species pool is changing. And here I'm referring specifically to introduced species that have become widespread on their own and become prevalent, particularly after fire. And here's an example: two grass species, the Sonoran Desert on the first picture to the left. In the middle, you see giant reed in the Santa Clara River. And on the right, you see a tree, salt cedar, that's invaded desert riparian areas, bringing more fire into those places. So these things change the response of the systems to fire, and they often promote, having trouble advancing, more fire, creating positive feedbacks to favor future fire. So this is a really important reason why you might want to get in after fire and try to get natives back instead of these non-native species. The second reason is that the fire regimes themselves are changing, and often this is due to humans. So for example, in the Sierra Nevada, we've seen return intervals between fires getting much longer than was the case when Europeans first arrived here through fire suppression. But in Southern California, we're seeing much more frequent fire through human ignition. And then the third thing that is causing us to have to think about doing restoration in the face of fire is that climate is changing. The post-fire environment is often now inhospitable for the regeneration of those very same species that have evolved in this fire regime. So together, these numbers 2 and 3 lead to the loss of resilience of the native species. And it's this loss of resilience that allows the invasive species to tend to dominate these sites. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to use 2 different case studies to talk about not just the when and why, which I've already given you some insight into, but the really challenging issue of how to approach post-fire restoration in these changing landscapes. And I'll use the Hawaiian dry forests and California chaparral as my examples, because in both of these cases, invasive species have contributed to changing fire regimes, or humans have contributed to changing fire regimes, and invasive species are playing an important role in regeneration. So I'll start with Hawaii. I've worked in the dry forests of Hawaii for 32 years now. And most people think of Hawaii as a place full of tropical green, lush plants where fire would not be an important evolutionary force. But in fact, most of the islands have a windward and a leeward side, and the leeward side tends to be dry or seasonally dry. Yet fire was not an important evolutionary force except at higher elevation where lightning occurred. And part of the reason is that they don't have fuels that carry fire across these landscapes until the introduction of invasive pasture grasses in the late 18 and early 1900s. And these grasses have come in, they were brought in mostly for grazing, and filled in the space between the native shrubs and trees and created a fuel bed that has now changed the landscape and resulted in a widespread occurrence of fire. So here's a transect that I've been monitoring with my collaborator, Stephanie Jelinek here. I've followed the same transects now for almost 40 years. And after fire in many of these sites, you see the almost complete conversion to African grass domination. So we've documented and published that fire size increases enormously, fire frequency increases. There's a pretty significant loss of native species, and that invaders persist for decades, and the sites tend to reburn. So frequent fire and invasive grasses are eliminating entire assemblages and creating the grass fire cycle. So in terms of thinking about when and why, most of these lands I'm talking about are controlled by the National Park Service, and their goal is to preserve and protect the biodiversity of these unique Hawaiian ecosystems. So what do they do in the face of these threats? How can you approach restoration when you need to try to enhance diversity, but you're facing these invasive species and fire? So the approach that we took, and I began this work in the mid-1990s when I realized just how dire the situation was, working directly with Natural Resources Management at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. We identified potentially fire-tolerant native species. We evaluated their potential to survive with invasive grasses through research and competition. We collected and tested and stored seed. A lot of these seeds are difficult to germinate. We had to know how are we going to get them to germinate if we put them out there? And then we conducted experimental seeding of our species that we selected into burned sites. So we took sites that had already burned and we conducted prescribed fire. So we used disturbance to our advantage to create a window in which to get native species back in the system before the grasses came back, which is an eventuality there. So we had usually about a 2-year window to get native species established. So we did not try, these are some of our winner species. We did not try to go back to this pre-fire assemblage because the dominant tree and the most abundant understory shrub do not come back at all and cannot tolerate competition with grasses. So we decided you really have to go forward to something new. And this looks kind of messy here, but it's actually one of our seeded plots with 3 different natives sharing dominance on the right side here, but still growing with some of those invasive grasses. So our lesson here is that in the face of these really significant threats, you can't go back to the pre-fire state. So if you want a native species assemblage, you need to have novel solutions and to create novel assemblages. And this was really a controversial idea when I first presented it to Hawaii Volcanoes National Park at a public forum. But since then, I think most people have accepted that this novel assembly approach has to be the route forward in order to keep native species in these ecosystems. So let's jump to fire regime and restoration in Chaparral. So looking back at this diagram of fire regime, let's think about what is the characteristic of a fire regime for Chaparral. And these numbers here come from a paper by Keeley and Fotheringham. The fire regime was considered historically to be something that fires burning in June through October, return intervals varying from 30 to 100 years, depending on how dry or moist the habitat is. So in San Diego County, for example, where it's much drier, fire return intervals tend to be more frequent. And in Central California and interior Santa Barbara County, fire return intervals tend to be longer. So fire size is variable, intensity and severity is typically quite high, and the type of fire that burns in Chaparral is a crown fire. And a lot of people are confused by that because Chaparral seems like, oh, it's shrubs, they're an understory, but there is no overstory. They are the understory and the overstory. The understory under them does sometimes burn by itself if you're in a riparian zone, but otherwise it's bottom from the soil to the crown that burns. So high intensity crown fire is the norm in Chaparral. So no matter whether you read about a devastating fire that just toasted all the vegetation, that's the norm. Species are adapted to it. These high intensity fires stimulate the germination of obligate seeding species, such as these Ceanothus megacarpus seedlings seen here, that are stimulated through smoke and heat to germinate. And resprouting shrubs that have lignotubers below ground also are stimulated to resprout after fire. So this is the norm. But what's happening in Chaparral due to humans and invasive ignitable grasses is an increase in fire seasonality. So we now have fires from May through December and January. Part of that is due to climate drying. And we're seeing some areas where return intervals are 2 to 30 years, so much shorter than was considered the norm. I won't talk much about the intensity and severity changes, but there's some evidence that once you start to lose some of the chaparral species and gain invasive grasses, actually intensity goes down. But let's focus really here on this changing fire return interval, because we believe this is really the key to loss of chaparral. And as an example that we know we have shortened fire return intervals, here's a view. We live up in the mountains here, looking over in the San Ynez Valley on the other side of Paradise Road. This hillside in the foreground burned in the White Rock Fire in 2013, and then again in the Ray Fire in 2016. So only 3 years between fire. So we are starting to see these short fire intervals, even in Santa Barbara County. This is a map created by my student Stephanie Moss showing short fire return intervals in Ventura and Los Angeles counties, the green showing area that was mapped as chaparral in the 1930s, and the brownish colors being the places where we're seeing these short fire return intervals. And so you can see that it's quite extensive through the Santa Monica Mountains and through some of these other areas to now have places that are burning in less than 10-year intervals. So why is this a problem? Well, an important real issue here is that obligate seeding shrubs, such as these Ceanothus seedlings, take about 10 years, 8 to 10 years, to start putting seed back into the soil seed bank, where they will then sleep until the next fire. If you can't get that seed bank replenished and another fire comes through, then those species will be knocked out of the system. And that's been documented in other parts of Southern California by John Keeley's group. Now you think, okay, so we lose a few obligate seeders. Is that a big deal? I go back to this picture that I started with to point out to you, these flowering shrubs are all obligate seeders. So this is Ceanothus megacarpus in the Santa Monica Mountains. So if you take those individuals out of this picture, all of a sudden you have a landscape with a significant amount of open space. And that open space becomes filled with introduced annual grasses from Europe that are now widespread, filling the space where obligate cedars once were. And on the left is such a patch of ground in the Santa Monica Mountains. And on the right is such a patch of ground in the Los Padres National Forest near Piru. And you might think, well, that's not really going to happen in Santa Barbara County because it's a lot more moist here. And as a result of that moisture, we do have a greater diversity of resprouting shrub species, but we also have large areas that are Ceanothus or these obligate cedars. And here's a patch of one of those. And this is an area that burned in the Jesucita fire in 2009. And the dead shrubs seen here with some of my undergraduates in a class in the background, toasted in the Thomas fire. In the next year after that fire, so these shrubs were about 7 years old when they were burned again. We came in and surveyed, and we found no seedlings of Ceanothus megacarpus. We found mostly invasive grasses and some native vines. So we are starting to see the overlap of fire in some of our California Santa Barbara ecosystems. And when they are dominated by obligate cedars, we're starting to see the incursion of grass. So essentially, this is another spot that actually was the overlap of the Tea Fire and the Thomas Fire. And we see there are resprouting species coming back in here, but we're seeing this, what I would call a slow savannahization on conversion of chaparral. So what is so bad about conversion to annual grasses? Some people actually prefer having grasses around them because they're easier to clear than chaparral shrubs. Well, the first point I want to make is that they are much more ignitable. And so these are some data from my student, Robert Fitch, showing that introduced annual grass, LFM here stands for live fuel moisture. This is a really important index of the likelihood that vegetation is going to result, that ignition is going to result in a big fire. And here he shows the live fuel moisture of the annual grasses, which is that orange line, diving in May, while the live fuel moisture of chamise, our classic chaparral shrub, in green, staying much higher than this gold line. This gold line is the critical live fuel moisture level that managers look at when they worry about fire danger. And our native perennial grasses in blue, maintaining much higher live fuel moisture into the summer compared to these exotic annual grasses. And in the picture down in the left, you see these exotic grasses in a picture I took in May near my house compared to the chaparral shrubs. So basically we're putting a lot of kindling on the landscape. And just to drive home the point that grasses are ignitable and they can fuel really destructive fires. This is an aerial photo of the Marshall Fire, which burned in Colorado in December of this year, almost New Year's Day, destroyed 1,500 homes, and it was a grass-fueled fire. It raced across grassland, and then it became a house-fueled fire when it got into these developments. But all the fuels surrounding it in which it initially spread were grasses. And one more point about grasses being so ignitable, an analysis of home loss in the Santa Monica Mountains by Alex Seifard suggested that homes that were surrounded mostly by grass had a somewhat higher probability of burning than those surrounded by other vegetation types. And she doesn't provide much more insight on that, but it could be because most fires are preceded before the flaming front gets to the house by an ember storm. And that ember storm is going to ignite the grasses, causing fire to get to the houses much more quickly than it otherwise might. So what is so bad about conversion? Well, the first point was increased ignitability and the possibility of more and more fire. Grasslands of the world burn at higher fire or low fire return intervals compared to shrublands. Reduced biodiversity and wildlife, decreased infiltration of water during winter rains because there are no pathways for that water to infiltrate along the root systems of plants. Grass roots are very shallow. And also because the canopy is very homogeneous and not as good at deflecting the impact of rainfall as a shrub canopy. Increased erosion, and then finally reduced overall productivity and carbon storage. And carbon storage is incredibly important because nowadays we're trying to get carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the soil or into these slow turnover pools. So where is this conversion happening? I've already given you an idea that it's more abundant, more likely to happen in the South. And we did an analysis recently on conversion in parts of Ventura County within the Los Padres National Forest, asking the question, what parts of the landscape are most vulnerable to change? And the important point here, this is a graphic created by my student, Shane Dewees, that chaparral, which is in the green on the left in 1930, made up more than half of the vegetation type. But by the time you get to 2009, it's making up a lot less, and it's converting, when you follow these flow lines, the gray flow, it's converting to grass. So grass, which made up a relatively small proportion of the aerial photos in the 1930s, becomes much more abundant by 2009, and sage scrub vegetation also disappears, almost disappears. So using a complex spatial analysis tool, we concluded that the most vulnerable areas are southwest facing slopes. Those are going to be more arid. Lower elevation chaparral, and that tends to be where obligate cedars like Ceanothus megacarpus dominate. Places with shorter fire return intervals. And this next point, fire followed by strong multi-year drought, brings in the issue of post-fire climate and its relative importance in shaping what's able to recover in those sites. And then places close to roads also converted. So that means the places where we're going to want to do restoration are going to be hot, dry places on low elevation and south facing slopes. And they're going to be closer to roads where there's a greater chance of ignition. And so those are exactly the sorts of sites that we are trying to put some vegetation back in. So the goals that we've had in these projects that I've been working with my students on are to establish natives that persist or recover if fire does occur, because it certainly will occur, that support wildlife, pollinators, and food webs, that potentially outcompete or at least reduce the grasses and thus the future ignition probability, that store more carbon than these grasses by putting a lot of that carbon below ground, and then that might act as nodes of spread to the surrounding area. So we want species that hopefully could spread on their own. So how do we pick a pool of species in a landscape like this? Well, we do it in a few ways. The first thing we do is try to identify what we think the pre-degradation dominants are. And part of that involved like climbing up to this little patch of dark green up here on that hill slope, and looking at aerial photos to see places that didn't burn in the 3 fires that burned this area, and seeing what was there. And when we do that, we see these dark green leaved species. And I want you to get a nice impression in your brain here of what these species look like. Then we look at what's there today, these what I'm calling post-degradation, or just, I guess it should be degradation species. And when we look at those, we see a very different looking group of species, white powdery leaves, just totally different. And these are species that are more characteristic of what we consider to be sage scrub vegetation. So I just want you to compare those. Again, it's very interesting to me because the pre-degradation versus the post-degradation species make you, just the way they look, make you realize that physiologically something is going on in these degraded environments. And then we also considered a whole bunch of other species that are either very hard to find at the site or are somewhere nearby that we consider to be drought tolerant. And those include a wide range of things from, believe it or not, elderberry, which can actually do pretty well in these sites, black sage, chamise, laurel sumac, other things. So because we want to have diversity, we don't want to just put back the sage scrub species. So we've been planting these out, and Shane and Stephanie will tell you a lot more about that today, and focusing on different combinations of species and asking questions like, what are the traits of the winners and the losers? Do some combinations of species work better to achieve our goals of cover and suppression of grasses and carbon accumulation? And what parts of the landscape are easier to restore? So although the slope on the left looks like a fairly homogeneous slanted slope with grasses and a few scattered shrubs, there's actually a lot of heterogeneity to this landscape, and Shane might mention some of that work. Now, an additional approach that we're taking, and this is part of Stephanie's dissertation, is to ask the question, can the sage scrub species that are out there today be used as facilitators, hypothesizing that maybe some chaparral species can be facilitated by sage scrub species. And she's planted some of these into the understory of some of these sage scrub species. So the reality of this situation, like the situation in Hawaii, but maybe not quite as dire, is that we aren't likely to be able to go back, or at least it's very hard to go back. And what we might have to go forward to is a much more sage scrubby community, because that's a vegetation formation where most of the species are adapted to these hotter, drier conditions that might characterize the future. So we are looking for how to make a diverse and interesting community, and really hoping to get some re-sprouters in there that can persist in the new environmental conditions. So I want to end by saying that I hope these two examples, which are depressing in that they show that we're losing biodiversity and ecosystem function through this combination of changing fire regimes and invasive species, and that we can't easily go back, but that we can go forward, and we must go forward through solutions that are forward looking and that focus on function and not on the strict idea of restoring to what was there before. And that to go forward, we have to engage new ideas and diverse partnerships. And so I'll end by going back to my triangle and saying that this combination of research, application, education, and outreach can come together so easily in restoration, that restoration offers the opportunity to engage people in the landscape, in the process of discovery, and in working directly to make a better landscape today. So restoration is a way to reconnect people with the landscape and to help people to take pride in creating and maintaining the beauty and functioning of our landscapes. And with that, I'll stop and thank you again for being here.
So we have a few minutes for questions, and we got a couple in the Q&A. Thank you, everybody. Andrea asks, have you ever tried to interplant the sensitive natives after good growth of the tougher natives to increase diversity and bring back some aspects of the old community?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that is the direction that we'd like to go in. And so some of our current planting efforts are aimed at trying the sage scrub species first, because we think that they're definitely going to establish the best and most readily. And then once they're established, planting in the chaparral, more sensitive chaparral species. And that's kind of related to the issue of can these sage scrub species be facilitators for the chaparral species? We know that some things like toyon are dispersed by birds, and so they're likely to get defecated out. The seeds are going to be defecated out underneath places where birds perch, which are other trees and shrubs. So this idea of facilitation seems really promising. So far the trouble we've had is that we're doing this restoration in a really dry series of years, and so we're not getting fantastic establishment right away. And that makes it hard to get to that next step where we get to try to use the sensitive species. But I think it's a great point, Andrea, and I thank you for that question.
Okay, so next one is from Scott Cooper. He asks, do frequent high severity fires result in type conversion of forests to shrubland?
Yes, that's another very good question. I haven't studied forest conversion that much, although a person who had worked in my lab and did a master's in Bran, Anne-Marie Parkinson, did some work on the loss of conifer forests in the southern forests, particularly in the Zaka fire area. And we do see loss of conifers when there's crown fire and conversion to shrubland systems. This idea has been recognized for several decades. Dennis Odian, who had worked at the garden many decades ago and is now deceased, had recognized this alternation between conifer forest and shrubland as a result of high intensity fire. So I think it's a real phenomenon. The trees may eventually come back, but it might just take many decades for that to happen. So I think it's certainly a phenomenon we're going to be documenting more and more regionally across California with these high intensity crown fires that are being observed.
Got it. Thanks so much, Carla. We have more questions, but we're out of time for now. We're going to save them for the panel discussion, and we're going to go to our next speaker. Thanks again, Carla. And our next speaker is Nicole Molinari. She'll be addressing, so Carla's talk really set us up for how complicated this situation is. And you can imagine there's a lot of land in need of restoration. So how do we prioritize this work? So that'll be the topic of Nicole's talk. She's a community ecologist with a broad interest in the consequences of human-induced global change, including the effects of wildfire, biological invasion, climate change, and altered disturbance regimes on vegetation patterns. Dr. Molinari currently serves as the USDA Forest Service Province Ecologist for the 4 Southern California forests. That's the Angeles, the Cleveland, the Los Padres, and the San Bernardino, where she applies scientific and ecological principles to pressing management issues. Nicole received her BS in biology from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and her PhD in ecology and evolution from UC Santa Barbara. Nicole is stationed at the Los Padres National Forest headquarters, and she lives in Goleta with her husband and 2 little boys. I'm going to turn it over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Let me get my screen going. All right. Well, thank you, Denise, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in, especially on a Saturday. This is fantastic. I'm really happy to be here to recognize Carla and her contributions to post-fire restoration. This is an incredibly relevant topic at the moment, especially given the incredible amount of fire we've been experiencing in California. Over the past few decades, we've witnessed some of the largest fires in our state's history, with 18 out of 20 occurring since the year 2000. And a huge emphasis is placed on extinguishing the fires and getting the fires out before they can affect humans and infrastructure. But after the fires contain, there are people like me and Carla and many of today's speakers who are challenged with figuring out the next step for these fire scars. And this is no easy task, and it's further complicated by the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all model for understanding recovery and degradation for the diversity of ecosystems that we have across the state of California. So today I'm going to wrangle it in a little bit, and I'm going to focus on chaparral shrublands. They encompass roughly 13 million acres in California, and they provide numerous ecological and human values. Many of these were already covered by Carla in her talk. And given these values, it's notable that chaparral has been one of the primary vegetation types affected by fire, with almost 40% burning in the last 20 years. So following fire in chaparral, there's always a question of whether recovery will happen naturally or whether restoration will be necessary. So in order to answer this, we need to know a bit about the barriers to chaparral recovery. And Carla did a great job of discussing this in her presentation. But before we go there, I just want to acknowledge the amazing ability of chaparral to recover following stand replacing fire. So chaparral species, they're adapted to high severity events, and they have the capacity to rebound. But despite this ecosystem, as Carla has noted, does have an Achilles heel. Recovery can be affected by too frequent fire, and this is especially true for those species, those obligate seeders that regenerate after fire from seed, and they need time to reach maturity, establish a new seed bank before the next fire rolls in. So too frequent fire can definitely affect their recovery. Drought and non-native species, specifically non-native annual grasses, can also affect the recovery trajectory of these ecosystems. So taken together, all of these things can move chaparral away from shrub dominance and towards an invasive annual grassland. So a key task following fire is to identify areas where recovery is expected. That's the picture seen on the left-hand side of the screen, versus areas where we might expect degradation or type conversion to occur. And that's shown in the picture on the right. So we need a rapid assessment that can guide decisions about these burn landscapes. Oftentimes there's not sufficient time to sit and wait and see which of these paths, the landscape goes down after fire. It's important to get out in front of the problem. And so to help with this need, we developed a post-fire restoration prioritization tool. We call this the PREP tool. And the concept was first developed by collaborators at the University of Barcelona and the Mediterranean Center for Environmental Studies. And they developed a post-fire prioritization tool for Mediterranean ecosystems in Europe. And we adapted that tool to chaparral ecosystems in California. And this was led by a team of scientists from UC Davis and the Forest Service. And so the framework for the PREP tool is shown in the box on the right. And that includes, as you can see, it includes the key factors that lead to impediments to recovery. So you see fire history, drought, the presence of non-native species. And then as you move down through that schematic or for that totem pole, you see at the very bottom the output. And the output from the PREP tool is a map of regeneration capacity. And it can be used to determine where recovery will likely occur naturally and where it may require more active management in order to get native species back on the landscape. So this tool was piloted on the Copper Fire, which is on the Angeles National Forest. And this is a chaparral dominated landscape. And there was concern here for chaparral recovery. So the tool was developed. And we also did some field work to determine the ability for the tool to predict recovery versus predict areas where restoration might be necessary. So we don't have time to go through each of these steps, but I do want to point out that the PREP tool is a mapping exercise. So it pulls in spatial data from across the state. So it looks at vegetation type, and this allows us to assign a proportion of resprouters versus cedars, because we know that those two different functional types respond to fire and drought and non-native grasses differently. So we use these mapping products. And I just want to mention, for those of you who haven't looked into the mapping products that are available for California, we are sitting on some amazing data sets. And a lot of these data and these maps are produced and derived from remotely sensed imagery. And so the PREP tool is able to pull all of these together, all of this information together in a decision framework, and it functions using a point system. And then it outputs, as I said before, a map of regeneration capacity. So here's a map of regeneration capacity for the Copper Fire, and areas in red are predicted to have low regeneration capacity, meaning they could benefit from restoration, while the areas in green are at the other end of that regeneration capacity spectrum. And these indicate areas where restoration may be needed, or sorry, where restoration is not needed. Okay, so this is a table, and this includes the acreage and the percent of the fire scar that falls into each of these regeneration categories. And the first thing I want to point out is that the majority of this fire scar, 70%, is predicted to recover on its own. And this is a testament to the resilience of these ecosystems. There is, however, 1,600 acres, or a little under 10%, that's predicted to have low regeneration capacity. So that's a potential for a whole lot of restoration within this fire footprint. And chaparral restoration is expensive, it's time consuming, it's logistically challenging. So it's probably not likely that we'll be able to restore this much acreage. So it's important to figure out a way to pare down these areas and develop some sort of prioritization framework to help guide where restoration should be prioritized or could be prioritized. In Southern California, we've created maps for ecosystem services, and ecosystem services is a sort of a buzzword for places where are opportunities for benefits to humans that can be provided by natural environments or from healthy ecosystems. So we can use ecosystem service data to refine where restoration could happen or could be prioritized on the landscape. So the maps on the left show some of those ecosystem services: biodiversity, carbon storage, sediment retention, and water recharge. And these are all mapped out within the Copper Fire. And any one of these layers could be used to refine the 1,600 acres that have been identified, and potentially these could be the priorities for restoration. And an example of how we could use one of these layers would be if there were concerns about soil movement affecting downslope communities, then the sediment retention layer could be used to decide where to plant deep-rooted native species. And that could help reduce soil movement and lessen the impact on communities that fires have burned nearby. So that's one way to use this information. Perhaps though, all the ecosystem services are important. And so it's possible to stack these different layers and create a single map that shows ecosystem service hotspots. And so I've done this, and this is shown as a map on the right. And the pink areas in this map show where all the services rank high. So here's a close-up. This is an overlay of low regeneration capacity areas from the PREP tool with these ecosystem service hotspots. And so areas with high ecosystem service values, those are the areas seen in pink, and low regeneration capacity. Again, this is from the PREP tool, and these are the areas outlined in white with, if you get really close, you can see there's black hatching there. These might be our priorities for restoration. So this is an example of how we can identify the most important places to invest in restoration and where restoration may result in the greatest good. So the final thing that I want to discuss is how we decide what to do in these degraded areas. What should our restoration targets be? This is a picture that shows a restoration project that's being led by one of Carla's graduate students, Robert Fitch. Some of you might recognize this. This is up on East Camino Cielo. And this area used to be shrubland. It's now dominated by non-native grasses, and it's in the process of being restored. For restoration projects like this, it's critical to ask whether restoration to a pre-fire condition is feasible. Is this landscape still able to support the same species that were here prior to disturbance, or have the conditions just changed too much? And one way to address this is to consider the current and anticipated future conditions, and then use them to select species and to guide restoration planning. So one of the things we should be thinking about here is climate change and whether restoring to a pre-fire or a historical condition makes sense given the conditions on the ground. So if it's hotter and drier today than it was when those original chaparral species established, then perhaps we won't be successful with replanting to a pre-fire condition, simply because the landscape will no longer be able to support these species. So if we want to maximize restoration success, it will be important to take things like climate change into account. And so this is an example for how we might do that. The map on the slide shows climate change projections for a small piece of the copper fire. And the areas in red and orange are predicted to experience high and very high climate exposure by mid-century. So this is 2040 to 2069. And then the areas mapped in blue and green are mapped as climate refugia, where future climate conditions are predicted to remain suitable for chaparral vegetation. And the last thing on the map that I want to point out is that there's the black hatching, and these polygons are areas where the PREP tool predicted there was going to be low regeneration and therefore potentially the need for restoration. So I've added black arrows to the slide, and these point to areas that have been identified as having a restoration need and also fall within areas that are predicted to serve as climate refugia. So from a climate perspective, it might be reasonable to restore to a pre-fire condition. And in the case of the copper fire, this would consist of adding species that are found within the intact parts of the fire scar. This is things like Ceanothus, Chamise, and Manzanita. Alternatively, black arrows now point to parts of the landscape that have been identified as having very high climate exposure over the next 20 to 50 years. So in these areas, it might be wise to move towards restoration of species that are more drought tolerant. This may include species found at lower elevation or drought tolerant deciduous plants like sage scrub. And so these pictures are actually from a restoration project in the copper fire, and these sage scrub species are doing quite well. We can take a similar approach using the frequency of fire. And so this map shows the number of fires within a portion of the copper fire And the areas in green have experienced 1 to 2 fires over the last 40 years. And so from a fire frequency standpoint or fire return interval standpoint, they're probably not at risk from too much fire. But the areas in yellow and orange and red, these have burned 3 to 5 times over the last 40 years. So they're burning much more frequently, or they have a shorter fire return interval today than they have in the past. And we should think carefully about restoration targets in these areas that are experiencing this sort of frequency. So the black arrow is pointing to an area recommended for restoration. You might have to really stick to see, but there is some black hatching over the spot. And this area has also experienced 4 fires in the past 40 years. So this is a 10-year fire return interval. So it's been experiencing frequent back-to-back fires. So this is far outside of the historic burn frequency of Chaparral. So we should question whether it makes sense to restore to a pre-fire condition. Perhaps we'd be more successful planting fast-growing species that can reach maturity quickly. And this might include native bunch grasses or using rhizomatous species that can tolerate frequent disturbance, things like giant wild rye, or potentially fast-growing shrubs that can reach maturity and produce a seed bank before the next fire rolls through. Okay, so in conclusion, the PREP tool was developed to rapidly assess the post-fire landscape. And this is especially useful in large fire scars, and we're seeing many more large fire scars every year. And in these large fire scars, it's challenging to get boots on the ground. It's hard to get people out to walk around and characterize these vast burned landscapes. Later today, however, Josie will be talking about how citizen scientists can be deployed to help with this effort. So these two things combine, the PREP tool, citizen scientists, getting people out on the ground can really help increase our understanding of these post-fire landscapes. I showed an example for how ecosystem service data can be integrated into prioritization efforts. It's also possible to use local information on wildlife use or recreational use, and this can help guide where restoration may be most valuable. Climate change and fire history data can be used to adjust our desired conditions for restoration, and they can help select appropriate species for restoration. And the goal here is to recognize that these are not static landscapes, and in order to maximize restoration success and in order to get natives back on the landscape, we may need to think outside the box. And Carla spoke about this in her earlier presentation, that we may need to move forward, but move forward in a different direction than what was there in the past. And lastly, identifying the areas in need of restoration. So basically the things I've been talking about is really just the beginning. I can't emphasize this enough. There's still an incredible amount to learn about how to do restoration. Thus far, Chaparral restoration has proven quite challenging, but there are some great minds dedicating a lot of time and energy into this topic. And you'll hear from 2 of those people in the next talk. So I just want to leave you with, we're at a point now where we're learning a lot and we're getting better at this all of the time.
Nicole, thank you. That was super smooth. I like that a lot. First thing that comes to mind is just that, you know, we have all these challenges, but what strikes me about this is just the big data. There's so much data and so much computing power and all the sophisticated mapping that we can use to make these choices. And it made me wonder how fast is fast? How rapidly can you deploy this after a fire?
So the idea, so we've used the PREP tool on about 6 fires at this point. And I will say that the first couple of fires took us a while to kind of get things going, but I now have many of these data layers processed. And the goal here is to try to run the PREP tool within 6 months following the fire, so that if there is going to be a need for restoration, that we can start the wheels turning, we can start looking for funding, we can start growing out plants and try to get in and start restoration before the annual grasses and some of the non-natives have really taken a foothold. I think that that is one of the complications with our ability to restore, is that oftentimes we go into these projects 5 or 6 years after the fire, and there's really, the non-native grasses really have a stronghold in those situations. And so if we can get in earlier, we might see a little bit more success.
Awesome. So there is a pretty specific question from Andrea that hopefully you can type an answer to. We're at the 11:10 mark where we're supposed to take a break, and I think that'll require going back to that slide anyway, so I'll give you a chance to.
Okay. Thanks, Denise.
We're gonna give everyone just 10 minutes to, get your comforts together. It is a Saturday morning after all, and we'll see you again at 11:20. Also, Susan, you had a really great question up there, and I think that deserves a lot of attention in our panel discussion, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the 9th Annual Santa Barbara Botanic Garden Conservation Symposium. Our next speakers are Shane Dewees and Stephanie Ma. They're both students in Carla D'Antonio's lab. And, I think we've seen from these first talks how complicated this can all be, and they're going to talk about some of the things we have on our side, things like getting more hardy plants established first and using a lot of volunteer help. So Shane's video popped up here. His dissertation work and broad research interests are focusing on understanding the drivers of vegetation fluxes, how to apply ecological theory to inform restoration ecology, and post-fire effects on tree and shrub physiology. He's passionate about preserving California's amazing floral biodiversity and hopes that his research can play a small role to that end. Stephanie Ma is also in Carla's lab. She studies shrubland restoration and the impacts of drought on chaparral recovery following fire. She's a plant community ecologist with a focus on Southern California chaparral, and earned her BS from UC Davis and master's from UC Santa Barbara. She's interested in applying her skills to the protection and restoration of local plant communities and engaging with the Santa Barbara community, including potential future ecologists. So I'm going to turn it over to you two. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us here. We're excited to share some of our work with you all today. And yeah, Carla and Nicole set up really nicely the need for chaparral restoration and where it might occur. And so Stephanie and I will share our experience with what that work actually looks like and how we can hope to make it more successful going forward. And so before we dive into that, though, we wanted your help solving a commonly discussed field debate of which is the better snack, goldfish or Cheez-Its. Feel free to throw that in the chat and we'll circle back to it in a little bit. But so the work that we'll be talking about today occurs just outside of Piru, California, where Carla showed some pictures of already and discussed the need for restoration out there. And as you can see, it's almost directly inland from the Botanical Gardens in the western edge of the Los Padres in Ventura County. And as you can see in the background, it's comprised of a very heterogeneous landscape of a wide range of elevations, aspects, and vegetation types ranging from trees, sage scrub, chaparral, and non-native grasses. And as Carla showed earlier, previous research that I've done in the area has showed that from 1930 to 2009, there's been widespread conversion of chaparral to non-native grasses, highlighting the need for restoration in this area. And we really see our work as a case study in chaparral restoration, with the areas that we're working in highlighting some of the hardest areas within this landscape to restore. Close to road, lower elevation, these southwest facing slopes that are going to be the most sun exposed and hot. And therefore are going to need the largest active human hand to restore and are not likely to passively restore over time.
So we will start by sharing some of the lessons learned from our field research, so kind of focused on the ecological framework that we've built and then also the social framework. And so thinking about the ecological framework, we found that transplanting seedlings was really successful, and then also focusing on the individual species that we're planting, controlling for weeds, specifically those non-native annual grasses, And then also considering the planting locations, so pre-existing locations and then creating new locations, and then restoring in phases. And then for our social framework, we found that, we worked a lot with UCSB students. And so meeting these students kind of where they were was really important, as well as creating an interconnected community. And then just the reminder to be joyful when working with these students. And so my research questions focused on kind of asking those initial questions of, how do you do restoration, chaparral restoration? And so focusing kind of on these bottlenecks or constraints, I focused on two main questions of kind of, how did these species get there? So the desirable species, are they present already in the soil seed bank, or are we going to need to bring plant material in? And then thinking about competition, again, with those annual non-native grasses, and then also with native species. And then through all of our fieldwork, we learned something about logistics in terms of personnel and time. And so Shane and I are both happy to talk more in detail about all of our research. I'll kind of give you an overview of my research right now. And so kind of looking at the first question of how do species get there, we looked at our species already present in the seed bank, and we found that no, there were no desirable shrub species that were present. And so we would need to bring in species. And then next we looked at, well, if we're going to bring in species, do we have greater establishment by seed or by seedling? And these are the 5 species that we focused on. So white sage, chaparral bush mallow, felt leaf yerbasante, chaparral yucca, and purple sage. And we found that we had greater establishment when we planted seedlings. And so kind of moving forward, transplanting seedlings worked for us. And then next, looking at competition. So again, looking at the competition with the annual non-native grasses. So if we remove that competition from those weeds, do we have greater survival, or how does survival change with the removal of these weeds? And we did find that we had greater survival with greater weed removal. So it really is important to control the weeds at the site. And then we looked also at the competition, or if there are benefits of planting seedlings kind of underneath mature shrubs. So maybe there is some competition for light and water, but maybe there's benefits if they're planted kind of in the shade under those mature shrubs. And we found that seedling survival was really dependent on the species. And so, thinking about the functional traits of it, it's really important to think about kind of the species and the growing conditions for that species. And then next, thinking about logistics, this is an image of our site. And so we would park kind of lower down on the road, and then we would hike up to my site's kind of midway up the hill. However, Shane's sites were all the way up at the top of the field. And so when we say that working with undergraduates allowed us to do a lot of this research, it's not a figure of speech. It's quite literal that they were really integral to our research. So they helped us clear sites, they carried equipment and plants, they helped us transplant, water, weed, and also collect data. And so through working with these UCSB students, we started to build a social framework of how to engage and inspire students. And so the first thing that we really found was useful was to kind of meet these students where they were. And so this could be physically of, where are they, getting their emails. And so posting to the UCSB listservs was really great at connecting with the students. And we worked a lot with Eric Zimmerman and Mike Tucker, who are the undergraduate advisors that send out the listservs. We also kind of met these students where they were in terms of experience. So for us, we didn't require any previous experience in the field. And so if students were just interested in trying it out, see if they liked fieldwork, they were welcome to join us. And then also scheduling. So we went out to the field on Saturdays just because that was the most flexible day for everyone's schedule. And then next, kind of, we created an interconnected community. So we wanted to create as many win-win situations as possible. So not only the students gaining field experience and then us, accomplishing a lot of field work that day, but then also thinking about flexibility for the students with their schedule and for us being able to have a full crew. And so we found that these shared sign-up sheets were really useful, where people could pick the week that worked for them, and then also we would know that we would have a full schedule. And then also learning together, so creating a supportive culture where we could ask questions and learn together. And then also networking, so sharing resources and job postings that we knew about with the students, and then also providing letters of recommendation or providing a job reference to, again, help those students that really found an interest in restoration to entering the career field. And then lastly, this reminder to be joyful. And so snacks were really an important part of the keeping morale high. So this also brings it back to the question of goldfish or Cheez-Its. So not only is it a snack that, a salty snack, but it also can provide fodder for a great game, which is, debating the benefits of one versus the other. Another game that we found that was really fun to play in the field was 20 questions. And then finally, photos. So in the field, we took a lot of photos, of action photos of the students kind of participating in field work. And then we always took a group photo at the end of the day. And then in the email afterwards, we'd share appreciation and thanks that they helped us with this work, but then also sent these photos out in the emails to hopefully remind them of all of the fun that they had that day. And so kind of with what we learned through the kind of asking those fundamental initial questions, and then also with working with students, this really led to this next phase of restoration or restoration research, kind of led by Shane, which focused on the different species in chaparral restoration.
Yeah, and so once we built that community engagement and Stephanie answered some of those super foundational and really important questions about chaparral restoration, we wanted to scale up with our research and go from the plot level, where you might have more homogeneous sites, to the landscape level, where you're going to have a much more heterogeneous landscape and where larger restoration projects are really going to occur. And with that, we had a goal of creating an ecological framework kind of centered around 3 main questions that would allow us to understand the ecology behind what we see with our restoration success and develop better methods to lead to higher success in the long term over time. And so the framework that we're trying to develop is really centered on these 3 questions of: where in a landscape can species survive? Can some species help others survive better? And then can we extend where in a landscape we can get our species of interest to survive? And so today, I'm mainly going to talk about our research focused on this first question, as the second and third are still ongoing projects, but I will discuss them briefly in the end. But focusing on just looking first at where out in the landscape different species can survive. We planted over about 6 acres with 10 different species for a total of just over 1,600 individuals. And this picture can start to give you a scale of what that looked like. If maybe you can see all of these little flags across the landscape, and those are all individual planting locations where we put a plant. And this is representing maybe only about 1/3 of our site. And so you can see how this got very large very quickly. And that's where that community engagement was really essential. We had undergraduates helping us with clearing out each individual planting location, getting the plant material up there, putting all the plants in the ground. And then, as Carla alluded to, the last couple of years of work out here has been incredibly dry. And so we've had to help water them during the growing season to help our plants establish and keep them alive, to give them a chance going into the summer. And so as far as what we found, this graph here shows the number of plants alive on the y-axis over time on the x-axis, with all of our plants about 1,600 when we finished planting around March of 2020. And then the real takeaway of this is, while we saw some mortality going into the end of the growing season, largely due to gopher activity and some transplant shock, by far the largest degree of mortality that we saw was during that first summer, from going from the end of the growing season in May to when we theoretically should have first rains in November. To add to the challenges that we saw, this was an abnormal year where we didn't get our first rains until closer to January. And so we did see some further mortality here. But after that second winter, after planting those first rains, we see a dramatically flattened out slope of less plants dying. And so this really highlights that first summer drought and the water stress associated with it is the largest barrier to restoration in our area. And as far as species-specific responses, we planted 4 different sage scrub species, 2 true sages, California brittle brush, and chaparral yucca. And we can see that while all 4 species show some decline during that first summer and then flatten out, we have fairly high survival ranging from about 25% to 50%. And when you look at these species, like Carla showed in her presentation, we see that these species have a variety of drought adaptations that help them survive better. And so this can be having almost succulent-like leaves, the yucca down here, to high reflectance, to these little crenulations, to being drought deciduous that allows them to drop their leaves during the worst parts of the summer drought, and then with first rains leaf back out. And so all 4 of these species survive fairly well on the landscape. Whereas our true shrubs, our chaparral shrubs, we see for the most part much steeper declines during that first summer drought, and then a range of survival ranging from about 0%, with almost all of our individuals being dead for Ceanothus and Toyon, to about 5 to 25% for some of our other species. And again, looking at these species, for the species that did better, like elderberry, sugarbush, chamise, and laurel sumac, we think this is really a combination of 2 things. First, all 4 of these species have the potential for stored carbon. This is maybe best seen on the left with our elderberry and our roost, our sugarbush. You can see they have these really thick, juicy root materials right below ground, or they're starting to form what we call lignotubers, which are these organs for specialized carbon storage. And it can allow them to kind of shut their leaves down during the worst of the summer, minimize evaporation and transpiration, and then start kind of survive off of those stored carbon. And then additionally, the chamise has extremely small leaves, minimizing the amount of evapotranspiration that might occur in the summer, whereas our laurel sumac and sugarbush have these folded, almost taco-like leaves that allow them to, again, minimize the amount of leaf exposed to evapotranspiration at a given time. Whereas our Ceanothus and Toyon, they got hit a lot harder during that summer drought and have the lowest survival are these larger, bright green leaves that really have no protection from the sun and are just fully exposed. And that might help them photosynthesize more and grow more in the growing season, but might be more detrimental to them when they're seedlings during that first summer drought. And so going back to our ecological framework that we're trying to create, we do see that there are species differences across the landscape and where different species can survive. And so going to our second question, it kind of logically makes sense of if our sage scrub species survive better and can establish more across the landscape, can we use those to help our more challenging species survive at higher rates? And ongoing work that we're doing is looking at just that. And so here we can see a black sage that we planted a year later. And not only is it beautiful and large and seeding and flowering, all great things that we strive for at the restoration, but you can also see that it has this fairly large shadowed area around it that might be a more favorable microsite to plant some of those harder to establish species. And so ongoing research is looking at planting plots of chaparral and sage scrub communities together, and then chaparral plots in isolation. And we're hoping to track survival and see, and then also measure things like soil moisture, temperature, humidity, sun exposure, and see if as those sage scrub species establish, do they create more favorable conditions that then allow our more challenging chaparral species to establish at higher rates. And then lastly, kind of that last part of the framework that we're trying to develop is looking at, can we extend where on a landscape species survive with different growing conditions prior to outplanting? So does how we grow them in the greenhouse prior to outplanting better prepare them for the field? And so we can kind of imagine that the goal of creating this framework and then applying it is if we have a restoration area visualized here, outlined in black, at first pass, maybe with our first year of planting, we can establish sage scrub species across most of the site as represented in red here. And then some of our chaparral species with moderate restoration potential, like laurel sumac, chamise, sugarbush, and elderberry at some of the more favorable sites, parts of our restoration site. And then the following year, we might be able to follow up and use those pre-established plants as facilitators to extend the range of our moderate restoration potential plants to farther across the landscape and get some of those low restoration potential plants like Ceanothus and toy on the site. And then if our third part of the framework of seeing how we grow plants in the greenhouse is successful and we can extend the range, we can then extend all three groups of species farther across the landscape. And over time, this framework might allow us to go from a degraded site to a beautiful, diverse, restored shrubland as visualized here. And so with that, we want to leave you with some of the lessons we've learned from our research, and both ecologically and socially. And our emails are seen in case you want to follow up with any questions or discuss our research more. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Shane and Stephanie, thank you so much for your talk and your brains on this topic, because it's a challenging situation. We have to get creative, and I'm glad to see you got so much help with this. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, but I think some of them you can type the answer into, because we are at 11:40. We can save some for the panel discussion as well. So good job. Thanks so much. We're going to move on now to Aaron Ramirez and Michelle Wolfgang. And what we're turning to now is a couple of case studies. So, we're kind of going from the really big picture to, what are some ways we can really think about the implications of all of this? And they're going to be talking about big cone duck fir, which is just a super fun, charismatic species, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities there. Dr. Ramirez is a professor of environmental studies at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and research in his lab is broadly focused on the impacts of disturbance, fire, drought, and global climate change on the health, physiology, and management of trees and forests in the Western U.S. His ongoing and past projects cover a wide variety of topics, from adaptive management of forests to addressing socio-ecological vulnerabilities in complex urban environments. And then we have Michelle Wolfgang, who researched the co-occurring effects of droughts and wildfire on the growth and mortality of big cone duck fir under the supervision of Dr. Kevin Moffitt and Dr. Aaron Ramirez, while earning her master's in environmental science. After more than 5 years with the Environmental Protection Agency's Mid-Atlantic Office and Pacific Northwest-based National Health and Environmental Effects Laboratory, Michelle has recently joined the Forest Service at the Los Padres National Forest, Santa Lucia Ranger District as the new District Resource Officer. So congrats on that, Michelle. I'm going to turn it over to you too. Take it away.
Great, thanks, Denise, and hi everyone. And thank you for the invitation to share this research with you guys today. So I'll give you just a second here to Michelle to pull the slides up. But while we start there, I'm pleased to introduce this project that I've been involved with since 2016 to improve our understanding of and ability to protect one of the coolest species in California, in my humble opinion, Pseudotsuga macrocarpa, or big cone Douglas fir. For those of you that aren't familiar with this species, it's a rare conifer that's a close relative of the much more widespread and well-known species of the timber industry, Douglas fir, but is only found in our coastal mountain ranges in Southern California. And like many of the endemics we've been hearing about today in California, big cone possesses unique traits that allow it to survive in the California environment, such as high tolerance and resilience to droughts and wildfires. However, as we've also been talking about today, the 21st century has brought drought and fire conditions to California that go beyond historical ranges of variation and many of the ecosystems are adapted to. So in 2016, the Los Padres National Forest and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation initiated a restoration grant program to restore areas impacted by some of the large fires in the early 2000s. And in response to that program, we pitched an ambitious multi-year and multi-institutional effort led by a partnership between UC Santa Barbara and many of the folks we've been hearing from already today, and we'll hear from. Carla D'Antonio is the PI, as well as Max Moritz and Ryoko Ono. myself at Reed College, Kevin Moffitt at Washington State University, and great partnerships with the Los Padres National Forest and Nicole Molinari in particular. With the plan to restore big cone forests in Los Padres National Forest that had been impacted by a large wildfire in 2007 called the Zaca fire. From the outset, we identified several key challenges to big cone restoration in particular. First, we lacked an accurate picture of where all the big cone stands were in Los Padres. And secondly, we lacked some critical information about their biology and ecology that would allow us to design successful restoration strategies for the species. So our approach to this project was a three-phase strategy to first map big cone stands across recently burned areas in Los Padres using a combination of Google Earth imagery and fieldwork validation of thousands of stands across the Los Padres National Forest. We then aimed to use a combination of field and lab-based methods to improve our understanding of the biology and ecology of the species, including a combination of dendroecological methods, satellite-based remote sensing, ecophysiological studies, and cool microbial ecology on the fungal and bacterial symbionts that impact the success of big cone seedlings and adult trees alike. And then finally, we sought to use all that information to direct restoration outplanting efforts in areas impacted by the Zaca fire and to learn from the successes and failures of those outplanting efforts in an adaptive management type framework. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to cover all the interesting facets of this larger project, but I will say if you're interested in this work, in that larger picture, many of the lessons learned are being prepared for publication in a special issue in Frontiers in Forests and Global Change that's due out later this year. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Wolfgang, as Denise mentioned, a recent graduate of the master's program at Washington State University, who's going to tell us about her cool work on the dendroecological investigations into long-term growth and mortality trends that have helped us understand how big cone stands in Los Padres in particular are being impacted by recent climate change exacerbated drought and wildfires. So without further ado, welcome Michelle to the virtual stage.
Thanks, Aaron. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Michelle Wolfgang, and today I'll be sharing some of our highlights of the research titled Dendroecological Responses to Fire and Drought that Underlie Climate Resilience of Big Cone Douglas Fir. So I conducted this research between 2018 and 2021 at Washington State University under the supervision of Dr. Kevin Moffitt and Dr. Aaron Ramirez, who joins me today. And so here's a map of our study area. In the figure on the right, a dark gray outline illustrates the boundaries of Los Padres National Forest. And within the Los Padres National Forest, you'll notice a yellow hashed polygon representing the burn extent of the 2007 Zaca fire, and a red hashed polygon that represents the burn extent of the 2017-2018 Thomas fire. Together, these fires burned 380,000 acres of the Los Padres National Forest. So on the left, I've illustrated 3 study locations, which I'll refer to throughout the presentation as 3 fire drought histories, or FDHs. The green diamonds represent 10 dendrochronology, which is just a fancy way of saying tree ring, sampling site locations at Reyes Peak, which has not burned in the 20th and 21st centuries. And the yellow diamonds slightly to the left of that represent 29 site locations within the 2007 Zaca fire perimeter. And orange diamonds down and to the right represent our 7 site locations within the 2007-2018 Thomas fire perimeter. Since we recognize that forest management needs often drive study approaches and potential outcomes, I'll touch on that here. So in this study, we addressed the need for adaptive forest management of narrow range native species, such as big cone, under co-occurring fire drought stresses. We conducted a dendroecological assessment of the 20th and 21st century growth and mortality patterns of big cone and correlated those growth patterns to climate. The goal of our research was to assist current and future efforts of restoration plans as we respond to ongoing drought and wildfire conditions of the 21st century. So in the first part of my presentation, I'll address how 20th and 21st century growth and mortality patterns compared across the 3 fire drought histories. Our main takeaway in the evaluation of big cone growth and mortality patterns is that we found evidence to support that prolonged intense drought years may limit the resilience of big cone to regeneration after wildfire and may prime the trees for death during and post wildfire. In the case of the 2017-2018 Thomas Fire, which occurred after the 2011 to 2016 multi-year drought, the cause of death of trees sampled appeared linked to the fire, since most of the dead trees were found to have died after the growing season of 2017. So here I've illustrated what that looks like inside of a tree. This tree was cored in August of 2018, and the last full year depicted by this dark brown line is 2017. So now I'll walk you through a few of our additional evidence to support this claim. So at this point, we've proposed that multi-year drought may have primed big cone death during the Thomas Fire. Big cone are known as one of the most fire resilient and drought tolerant species in North America. Yet when we pulled these cores from the Thomas Fire perimeter, we observed that the trees were experiencing episodes of growth release and suppression, as illustrated here. So you'll notice that we have some wide rings here in this tree core, and that represents an episode of growth release, followed by several years of average growth, and then a lot of narrow rings here that represent growth suppression. So we found that in the Thomas Fire perimeter, we were vacillating between these types of growth release, normal years, and growth suppression. And so that signaled to us that the trees were likely experiencing some stressful growing conditions before the devastating wildfire had occurred in late 2017. The following 3 graphs I'll touch on here. I know there's a lot here, but bear with me. They describe what are observed as the growth release and growth suppression episodes across the 3 FDHs. So we have Ramirez Peak here on the left, Cisco Fire in the middle, and Thomas Fire here on the right. The top row graph describes the proportion of all trees at the site that are experiencing positive year-to-year growth. So larger sized bars, larger sized green bars, indicate that more trees at that fire drought history site were experiencing positive signs of growth. And then the middle row graph represents what are called marker years in dendrochronology. These marker years occur when trees at a site are experiencing unusual positive or negative deviations in growth compared to the surrounding 10-year growth period. So in the case of Thomas Fire, all the way on the right, we see that trees there were experiencing more of these vacillations in unusual positive and negative growth over the decades, the prior 2 decades. So the last graph there on the bottom is one that I'll spend the next 2 slides talking about, since it describes the positive and negative year-to-year changes in tree growth while accounting for possible differences in ages of the trees sampled. So we know we go out and we sample different age trees, and we account for that in dendrochronology with an age-related measure, which is the change in basal area increment. And that helps us decipher when, how the trees respond to disturbance events, such as prolonged drought and wildfire, while taking into consideration their age. So again, we know that big cone are extremely fire resilient and drought tolerant species. However, our evidence also points to a potential threshold in this resilience, especially as fire and drought become co-occurring stressors. For instance, when compared to the patterns observed at Ramirez Peak and Thomas Fire, or sorry, Ramirez Peak and Cisco Fire, Ramirez Peak is here, Cisco Fire is here in the middle again, and Thomas Fire is here on the right, we observe these higher amplitude and more frequent swings in growth release and suppression occurring earlier on in the 20th century, and especially in the years after about 1980 and before the multi-year drought. So this dotted line here represents 1980, and you'll see a lot of swings happening after that as well. And that's important to keep in mind as we move forward. So these changes also signal that perhaps the trees were experiencing stressed growing conditions within the Thomas Fire perimeter before the onset of the multi-year drought and before the wildfire. And of course, there is the possible other alternative explanations, such as an abundance of understory fuel loads or high canopy density that may have facilitated widespread big cone mortality resulting from the Thomas fire. However, these explanations don't fully explain what was going on in the tree growth patterns over time. So let's turn our attention now to a case where a fire preceded the multi-year drought, such as in the case of the 2007 Zaka fire. Again, here we have Zaka fire in the middle, Thomas fire on the right, and Rays Peak over on the left. If we observe the area of the graphs that represent the 2011 and 2016 multi-year drought, that gray hashed area, we can see that negative growth trends during the 2011 to 2016 drought across all the FDHs, regardless of when or if they burned in recent history. Recall that Rays Peak has not burned in recent history. However, we found evidence in our tree ring analysis to support that the multi-year drought has strained regeneration of big cone within the Zaka fire perimeter. And that we can see in, as the drought lifted in 2016, where this black arrow is pointing to, there's little to no recovery observed within the Zaka fire perimeter. Other sites have a little bit of recovery here and there, but the Zaka fire in 2016 and 2017, there's very little recovery there in basal area increment. So the following graph depicts the percent year-to-year growth change between 1995 and 2018. The blue line on the graph shows the fluctuations in percent year-to-year growth, and the dotted horizontal red lines depict where the radial growth change was either greater than 50% or less than 50%. The multi-year drought, again, is marked by that gray hashed area. And so also here we observe that big cone experienced over 50% radial growth change in 2003, and again in 2005 and 2008. So we know that we are observing similar responses of big cone across the landscape, and that big cone has resilience to rebound from wildfire or short-term drought disturbances, such as in the case of the 2007 Zaka fire. And you can see that here as we turn our attention to the yellow boxed areas of the graph. We observed that Rays Peak and Thomas fire shared positive growth responses directly before and directly after the multi-year drought in 2010 and 2016, whereas Zaka fire had little to no growth during or after the multi-year drought. This evidence supports that prolonged drought, coupled with post-fire landscape conditions, such as those mentioned earlier, and including the loss of protective bark or living tissue and lower soil infiltration rates, may further strain post-fire regeneration within the Zaka fire perimeter during the onset and duration of the multi-year drought. So with that, I'll now turn our attention to the second question we addressed in our research. So how do radial growth patterns or the tree ring growth of big cone correlate with climate oscillations on an interannual, interdecadal, and multi-decadal timescale? And so don't worry if you're not familiar with all those different terms, we'll catch up to those in just a moment. As we move into discussing the results of the climate growth analysis, I'll need to point out that we did split this analysis into 3 major segments representing the 2 major switches in the Pacific decadal oscillation, which is the most regionally important multi-decadal ocean atmospheric climate regime. The PDO, as I'll call it, operates on a 20 to 30 year time frame and is documented to have influenced growth of conifer species in the Western North America. So that is why we correlated growth to it. This plot on the right illustrates the correlation between big cone growth at each fire drought history and the historical average total monthly precipitation values since 1900. The 3 columns here represent the PDO phases, while the 3 rows represent the 3 FDHs in alphabetical order. So Rays Peak is at the top, Thomas fire is in the middle, and Zaka fire is at the bottom. On the x-axis, we have ordered the months of the growth year from the previous October to the current September. And the green bars represent correlation coefficients between growth and PDO. Black dots that you'll see at the top of those bars represent where those correlations had statistical significance. So our main takeaway here is to note that the correlation highlighted by the blue boxes depict that big cone at all 3 FDHs responded positively to warm, wet winters during the warm, dry phases of the Pacific decadal oscillation. So this evidence indicates that big cone predominantly relies on winter precipitation to sustain growth during warmer, drier phases of the multi-decadal climate regime. The following bar plot is virtually the same as the last. However, this one illustrates how growth correlated with monthly minimum temperatures and over the 20th and 21st centuries. Again, that we split it into 3 time segments based on those 2 major switches in the PDO. So here we illustrate within those red boxes that hotter, drier summers, that late growing season, regardless of whether or not it was, that in the hotter, drier months of the late growing season, that negatively impacted our growth. So we see these bars dropping down on the negative side of the graph. And that happened regardless of the fire drought history or of the PDO phase. So this evidence is well aligned with the claim that most of us already know: soil moisture stress or heat stress is a limiting factor of growth in Southern California conifer species. So now this is the really fun graph part. We'll take a look more closely at the relationships between growth and multi-decadal climate oscillation of the PDO. Plots relating big cone growth response to the PDO index appear on the left. The PDO is known to have influenced growth of several conifer species over Western North America. So on the y-axis, we have this periodicity, which ranges from 0 to 64 years. So we are covering interannual to multi-decadal climate regimes. Time is on the x-axis. That's everything from the 20th and 21st centuries together. These colors on the graphs, they represent power levels. So the warmer colors indicate higher correlation values or greater significance. And those black arrows within those plots depict how the growth is responding to climate regime, whether the growth is lagging, meaning it's exiting the graph, or it's synchronous, as in it's going in with the flow of the years. And so again, Reyes Peak appears on the top. Zaca Fire is in the middle, and Thomas Fire is down on the bottom. So what we want you to notice here, we're looking at the dotted vertical line here, which depicts the recent 1976 to 1977 Pacific decadal oscillation switch from cool wet to warm dry. And we'll focus this interpretation on the periodicity relating to the PDO, which again is that 20 to 30 year multi-decadal climate regime. And so within these black horizontal dashed lines and in these boxes, we're looking at a periodicity of 16 to 32 years. And what is interesting about this is that big cone growth within the Thomas Fire perimeter was influenced by the PDO throughout most of the 20th and 21st centuries. And then in the mid 20th century, when the PDO phase switched to a cool wet, growth at all the FDHs responded favorably. All big cone growth exhibited a strong shift in synchronicity after 1980, after that PDO switch, suggesting that an interdecadal climate regime such as drought became a more important determinant of growth after that time. So we'll touch on that next. And now we'll just address how regional warming and drying has impacted relationships between big cone growth and an interdecadal climate regime. In this case, we'll talk about drought. Which is represented here by the self-calibrated Palmer Drought Severity Index, which very simply put, just estimates dryness on the landscape. These plots to the left are virtually identical to those you've just seen, except that they compare that Palmer Drought Severity Index to growth response. So we're now focused on the area of the graph that occurred after that PDO switch, because that's where we notice the downshift in statistical significance. The black circles here highlight all the years after 1980 and show where we have that downshift in the climate growth response. So prior to that switch, the climate growth response was most significant in the periodicity of 16 to 32 years. And after that switch, it was most significant in the periodicity of 4 to 8 years. So this downshift in periodicity suggests that big cone growth became more responsive to interdecadal and interannual climate regimes such as drought after that time. And just a few take-home messages really quickly here. So we know, again, big cone is incredibly resilient to regional long-term climate and wildfire patterns, yet recent large wildfires and multi-year drought are driving growth declines and mortality in big cone forests. Post-fire restoration is therefore key to big cone persistence in the ecosystem. Secondly, the maritime coastal influence has an important effect on growth response patterns of big cone and should be accounted for when designing active restoration efforts. And then restoration efforts need to target locations such as climate refugia, relatively buffered from the effects of the worsening drought and wildfire conditions we're seeing for long-term persistence of big cone forests in Los Padres. And I just want to give a shout out because I know Anne-Marie Parkinson is in the audience here, and we're currently working on a model of climate refugia for big cone and hoping to get that out into the manuscripts in a couple of weeks. So here again is my contact information if you'd like to contact me at any point in time. And thank you all for your attention today. This concludes my presentation.
Michelle and Erin, thanks so much. That is an impressive amount of data. We are behind on time, so we have to move on. But thanks again. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mo Gomez. He's going to be telling us about steelhead restoration. So back to when we're talking about the important things that biological diversity does for us, like holding together our slopes, that affects things like the steelhead. So Mo is the director of South Coast Habitat Restoration. It's a nonprofit organization based in Carpentry, and he's been working on watershed restoration projects for the past 17 years in the Santa Barbara and Ventura region. He's proud of the partnerships he's developed in his career to focus on steelhead trout recovery efforts. And when not working, he enjoys spending time with his family and friends exploring the great outdoors. So thank you so much, Mo. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Denise. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
I confirm.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Mauricio Gomez. I'm the director of South Coast Habitat Restoration. And this afternoon, I'm going to give a presentation on post-fire impacts on steelhead trout habitat and strategies for recovery. I'm very excited to be here and really appreciative of all the previous presentations. I'm learning a lot. I hope everybody else is as well. And I look forward to following up with some of the speakers to get more information on this incredible work that everybody's doing and all the science that's being shared with us. Thank you again, everybody, for your work that you're doing. A little bit about South Coast Habitat Restoration. We're a nonprofit organization that works to protect, conserve, and restore the various habitats and native biodiversity of the Santa Barbara region. How do we do this? Well, we do a lot of things. We perform habitat assessments, we do landowner outreach, we apply for and manage grants from different funders, whether it's state or federal agencies. We coordinate consultants such as biologists, land use planners, engineers, general contractors. We obtain permits for some of the implementation projects we do. We hire and oversee the contractors. We work with the contractors to ensure that the permit conditions are being met. And then we do community outreach and education, such as this afternoon. So a brief outline on the presentation, talk a little bit about steelhead trout. I'll take you all and get our feet a little bit wet in the presentation and share a little bit about steelhead trout, their life cycle, a little bit about their history, some photographs, some examples of fire impacts on steelhead in the streams. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the strategies for improving habitat that we're involved with, and a little bit overview on some of the future projects we're involved with. And just to kind of point out a little bit here, I wanted to say thank you to Michelle for showing me how to use the laser pointer in your presentation. I had never done that. That was really cool. This is a little bit of an outdated map. It's Southern California fires, Great Urban 1,000 acres that we put together from 2007 to 2018. So there's obviously been a number of fires since then, but when we put this map together, it was a little bit after the Thomas Fire and Woolsey Fire. And we were just struck by how much of our landscape across our region was being impacted by fires. And if we had gone back and included, another 20, 30 years back, most of this area would have been even lit up with some of these different fire scars. And so we're showing some of the watersheds, as well as highlighted in the by the watersheds, some of the critical habitat watersheds where steelhead trout are currently found, and there's efforts ongoing to try and do some recovery efforts in those systems. So a little bit about steelhead trout. They are very similar to salmon in that they're born in freshwater systems like rivers or creeks, and they can flow out to the ocean and then come back and spawn. They don't have to do that. They can stay within the freshwater system of the loop and retain their genetic integrity by growing in those areas. But in this case, a lot of our work is that migration of up and down the system is being blocked by a lot of different barriers, and the habitat to get to those upper watersheds is really impacted by fires. And I'm going to go over that in a minute. But before we get to that, I'd like to highlight just some of the photographs of what steelhead look like in our region and have looked like historically. So in the 1940s, this is a photograph shared by a family down in the Carpentry area where our office is based, and we've done a lot of our work in this watershed, Carpentry Creek. So this is a stringer of fish that a gentleman by the name of George Bliss caught one afternoon in the 1940s. So really incredible to see large fish like this at that time, and I'm glad that we have this photograph. Similar time frame in the late 40s. This is the mouth of the Santa Maria River, where there was a lot of fishermen at the estuary just catching a bunch of fish down that way. More recent, in 2008, again in Carpentry Creek, we have a couple photographs showing some steelhead trout. And this is the last time that steelhead trout have been seen in this watershed. So I just wanted to highlight this a little bit, where we've got two adult steelhead here, and photograph on the right, there's a female exhibiting behavior, making a nest, or in the fish world, we call it a red. And so you can see the female on her side, kicking up some suspended sediments, the little plume that's right here, and the current takes that and moves it downstream. The photograph on the left shows what all that work ended up enabling, a depression in the stream bed of fine sediments getting kicked up and moved out so that they can deposit their eggs, and those can then get protected within the interstitial spaces between the cobbles in the stream channel. If you notice very closely here, there's a small little fish, which we suspect is a male, that was looking to try and fertilize these. Unfortunately, this pool dried out. It was located downstream of a barrier to fish migration. And unfortunately, these fish all perished in the spring of 2008. Sorry to share bad news, but our work is making a lot of progress, and a couple other photographs here of steelhead. This is on San Ynez River, a 26-inch steelhead, and then over in 2017, another adult, about a 24-incher that was found in Maria Ignacia Creek in the Goleta area, and a small little male as well. Moving up the coast a little bit, in the Cisco River watershed, this is a photograph from a colleague in 2005, Matt Stecker, surveying the Cisco River watershed. And then in the Manzana watershed, this will be a little video, so let me see if this works. Great, it's working. You can see about an 8-inch trout in the Manzana system that we were doing some red-legged frog fish surveys, and came across this beautiful fish. And if you look very closely on the right, there's another little guy that pops into the, get a little photo bomb in the video there. So there's fish in the system, and they can be very impacted as a result of the effects of wildfire. And so before I show some of those effects, I wanted to show you some of the typical system settings that we see in the creeks. So this is Carpentry Creek. A few of these will be Carp Creek, where we're just showing a natural creek setting where you've got large trees, you've got a mixture of cottonwoods, sycamores, some alders in this watershed, and some vines growing in there as well. A lot of understory species, some trees that have fallen over, providing canopy cover. The stream bed itself has embedded rocks with nice water flowing through it. I'll show a couple other photographs here on the left. There's a nice pool here that's formed at the side of this boulder. On the right, we've got a run that's, again, having some nice stream habitat. Again, a lot of the trees in the area here providing nice shade. Steelhead trout really require cool water in order for them to spawn. And so as the water gets warmer, it gets more difficult for the fish for the eggs to survive. And so it can be dangerous for them. Another example of a nice creek setting in the Carpentry system. and another pool, just to kind of give everybody an idea of the befores, so to speak, of a system before a fire, which then gets impacted by rain events and or debris flow events. In this case, here's the examples of some of the fire impacts. So these photographs were taken in the Carpentry Creek watershed immediately after the Thomas fire. In fact, the fire was still burning in certain parts of the area where it was still causing impacts. And just kind of to highlight, you know, a lot of vegetation understories burned. You still have a lot of trees present in the ground, or on the ground, I should say, a lot of ash. Again, there's hardly any shrubs left. So your mugwort, your blackberry, a lot of those species were just gone. Your giant rye disappeared and just turned to ash. The slopes draining into the hillsides, into the creek, were mostly denuded in most areas in the system. Again, the riparian canopy stayed pretty intact. Not pretty intact, but it was highly impacted, but there were some trees. You know, here's a sycamore in the middle of the photograph. So a lot of impacts to the system. The next couple of photographs I'll show were taken a year after the debris flow event. And you'll see some of the surrounding areas having more vegetation, more green popping up in the photos, as well as the main thing I wanted to highlight is the stream channel is impacted here with a lot of cobbles here that had filled in the pool habitat that steelhead trout really require. In this case, there's a couple of colleagues from a consulting firm that we work with, Waterways Consulting. We were doing an assessment of the watershed where they're standing used to be a beautiful pool, and that pool had been completely filled in with fine sediment. Very difficult for a fish to live in those settings, of course. Another pool here that we had been tracking, you know, for many, many years, basically filled in almost to the rim, and doesn't have any habitat left available immediately after the fire and debris flow. Another photograph. This used to be a series of pools. Now it's just a stream channel, you know, with about 2-3 inches of water flowing through it. No habitat complexity for fish. This is a photograph from Romero Creek, where those debris flow impacts were a little bit more impactful to the stream channel. A lot of degradation happened and bedrock was exposed. Interestingly, as that area was exposed, bedrock that looks like had been exposed in the past probably and had water flowing through it, as evidenced in the middle of the photograph here. Again, a lot of fine sediment running through here, which filled in some of the pools and makes for really cool areas to inspect what's been walking in front of you, and maybe behind you as well. So you can see my boot on the left there, and on the right you can see what I'm pretty sure is a very large bear print. We're happy to say that we did not encounter it on the hike that day. You know, the systems seem to recover on their own in some cases with different species. Again, a lot of the information shared by the previous speakers is kind of maybe what you're thinking about as you're seeing this. This slope coming down here on the left is primarily dominated by a giant ryegrass. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of that got burned when the fire happened, but you know, it literally was weeks and there was already respouts coming up after the fire buzzed through this area. So vegetation comes back and then you get your occasional beautiful flowers, this Humboldt lily. So it was a beautiful flower to see one day when I was out there. It's exciting. So now moving on to strategies for improving. I'm going to run through this a little bit because I am running a little bit out of time. But I wanted to show you some of the work that we've been involved with in order to try and open up habitat for steelhead trout. I'm going to highlight a project that we're working with a lot of partners. It's the Davey Brown Munch Creek Fish Passage Project. The goal of the project was to increase access to a little over 3 miles of habitat for the federally endangered trout by removing 3 barriers to migration and building 2 vehicular bridges. It's located in the Los Padres National Forest within the Santa Lucia Ranger District. Our partners for the project are the United States Forest Service. We have a whole bunch of funders, Foundation, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Coastal Conservancy, County of Santa Barbara, the California Fish Passage Forum, Cal Trout. Our project budget's about $4 million. We have a great team of engineers, cultural monitors, bridge manufacturers, and contractors for the project. Here's almost everybody's logos. I hopefully didn't leave anybody's logo off of this. That's been involved in the project over the decades that it's been talked about by the Forest Service and partners in the community. So where is this project? It's located within the Santa Maria River watershed, sub-watershed of the Cisco River, and sub-watershed to the Manzana. And let me zoom in a little bit in a second. But first I wanted to highlight the Saca fire from 2007 fire perimeter. So I'll zoom in now, and you'll notice again on the upper right, that red, that's the fire scar area. So these projects are located immediately outside of that fire scar area. And it's really important for our projects to be located there because they're providing a refuge area for fish that were impacted from the very large area that the fire, I think it was about 240,000 acres that burned as part of that fire. So the projects are located on Davey Brown Creek and Munch Creek. Over the years, with funding from different partners and a lot of team members, and I got to stop here and highlight, this is a really big project that we're involved with, the huge team effort with us bringing in grant funding and engineers, and then the Forest Service doing an incredible job of working with us and moving the project forward. Everything from the permitting for the project to reviewing engineering designs for the project. There's so much work by so many different people, and I just wanted to stop and highlight Adam Furlow from the Forest Service engineering team, to Christy Close, fisheries biologist with the Forest Service, that we've been working very diligently to get this project going, and the engineers develop these designs to remove these barriers and build bridges across them so vehicles can get across. So let me show you a couple of those photographs. This is the Munch Creek site looking upstream. It was an old concrete slab poured across the creek. We went in there with the California Conservation Corps, removed it, and it now looks like this. Same vantage point. I'll flip back for a second. You see the tree that's kind of Y-shaped in the top. Same tree in the second photograph. That concrete's been removed. The concrete leading to the creek was removed, and this is now the new approach to the creek for the Davey Brown Trail. I'm going to do a quick little video showing the work that the California Conservation Corps did through a time-lapse camera that we have out here. And this was done in 2020. If you look at the thermometer that on the images there, it was extremely hot. It was over 110 degrees during the day. So these young men and women from the CCC did an incredible job of ripping up all this concrete and filling buckets up and hauling it off site in order for the stream channel to be restored. And we were happy that after many decades of that concrete being in place, the stream is now opened up for habitat. Moving on to the upper Sunset Valley Road site, this is the before photograph as you drive to the creek crossing, and this is the after photograph of the same site. Again, I'll go back the before, the after. So now we've installed a vehicular bridge that allows for vehicles to drive across, and the stream channel, this is looking up the creek, has now been restored as well, removing that concrete from the channel and improving fish migration opportunities. Moving on to the lower site, again, a before photograph, an after photograph, and an upstream shot looking up the canyon. You'll notice the creek banks are very bare at both these sites. We are in the process of doing revegetation out there, and we'll be working with the California Conservation Corps, the San Ynez Chumash Indians, as well as the Forest Service botanist and provincial ecologist to assist us with getting plants in the ground out there. And we might need to bring some buckets of water because the creek level is going low, and hopefully everybody can do their rain dance after the talk, and we can get a little bit more rain before this winter's over. And then moving on, I wanted to highlight kind of some of the other species that we've been encountering as we've been out to the project site in this beautiful part of our county. And there's red-legged frog out there. This is a photograph I took. They're just incredible, incredible looking frogs that I highly recommend everybody get a chance to see one. We had deer, we had scorpions. It's just beautiful, and just kind of wanted to highlight some of the other species that are out there. And we also mounted a camera at a location not too far from our project site, and we documented a lot of wildlife that is still present in this area. There's about 10 or 15 quick slides that I'm going to go over, just like a slideshow here, showing some of the different wildlife. And I have a before and after each one. Each of the befores has a critter, and most of the afters has a circle of where that critter is. So This is the before photograph showing a red-tailed hawk. I'm pretty sure that's what that is there. Second photograph here is the before, and here you got an owl down getting some drink of water from this pool. This is an interesting photograph. There's two animals in this photograph. You can probably see the skunk immediately there, and there's a skunk, and right behind it, about maybe 8 to 10 feet behind it, is a mountain lion that ended up going for a little walk behind it. And we got a series of 3 photographs, and then the camera didn't take photos. So I don't know what happened after that, but I'll let you all imagine what took place after that. We have a heron up here. We have a bobcat, bear, mountain lion, and another mountain lion photograph here. So just kind of wanted to show some of that stuff to you guys, because I think it's important to keep in mind all the different species that we're working with in our area to try to improve habitat. And the access for migration in the creek is important, but also the work that the previous speakers regarding improving vegetation communities is extremely important for all those critters as well. And I just lastly wanted to highlight some of the different watersheds that we're working on currently and into the future. We're working in partnership with the Nature Conservancy over at Dangermont Preserve on Halama Creek. We're doing some work on Gaviota Creek with state parks, as well as Caltrans. We're working with El Capitan Creek with state parks, on Rio Ignacio Creek with various private landowners, Carpentry Creek, and then the Ventura River with U.S. Forest Service as well, on some fish passage removal work out that way. And photograph up here on the top left is, I try to sneak in a photograph of my son, but he's now getting too big to sneak him in. So that's a photograph I took of him last year, looking at some snowy plovers here in Carpinteria. With that, thank you very much. Sorry I went over a little bit, but hopeful that you guys enjoyed the presentation, and just wanted to say thank you to Denise and the Botanic Garden for inviting me to give this presentation, and congratulations to Carla. Thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you, Mo, so much. It's so exciting to see all the big stuff that we can still accomplish and all the great effects up the food web that has. So thanks so much for the photos and videos. That was great. Everybody, we're going to take a lunch break and we're going to reconvene at 1 o'clock. So we'll see you then. Okay, everybody, it's 1 o'clock and we are back. We're going to shift now to the land manager perspective. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Mendelson. He's a botanist for the National Park Service at the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. He's a native of Ventura County who received his education from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, San Diego State, and several amazing botanists and wildlife biologists. Mark has been working with the flora and fauna of the Santa Monica Mountains and Simi Hills for 10 years, following prior biological research and consulting for the U.S. Geological Survey, as well as private firms. So with that, Mark, take it away. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. I hope you had a nice, maybe botanically rich lunch. And I'll echo my fellow speakers and thank Denise, Josie, and the garden for this opportunity. And congrats to Carla. Okay, let's jump right in with an interactive quiz to test your fire follower site ID skills. Please enter into the chat, and you'll need to be speedy, the common name of the plant that I will point out. And there will be 10, one after another. Okay, here we go. Starting in the lower left, this herb, common Eucrypta. All right, this tall purple flowering one. Large flowered Phacelia. Sorry, I said you need to be quick. I don't have too much time. Okay, this orange one. There you go, fire poppy. This tall red one. Cardinal catchfly. How about this white droopy one? The beautiful globe lily. How about the resprouting tree in the background? There you go, coast live oak. Okay, this orange one in the lower there. Kind of tough. Miner's lettuce. How about this opposite leaved viney one in the background? Chaparral honeysuckle. And kind of hard to see, but this white tubular flowered one. There you go, the very common wild morning glory. And lastly, again, sorry, hard to see, depending on how big your screen is, this world-leaved herb in the lower right, annual bedstraw. Okay, well, I hope that provided some entertainment. Now here's a web resource and phone app I highly recommend to help you with identifying plants in the Santa Monica Mountains and Simi Hills, developed by one of our park's former botanists. So go to that URL, and if you don't have this, I highly recommend checking it out or downloading it onto your phone. And before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators in this work listed here, as well as a few others I'll mention later. For example, the dozens of solid interns and biotechs we've had throughout the years, some of whom are photoed here. The largest fire on record in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area and Simi Hills has been the Woolsey Fire, which burned about 90,000 acres in November 2018. In addition to the loss of life and tremendous damage caused by the fire, it activated over 2/3 of our complete set of 300 long-term vegetation monitoring plots, shown here as dots, with the pink line outlining the Woolsey Fire, green line outlining the recreation area, and the Ventura LA County line in light blue. Here's a photo series showing what we're monitoring, the status and trends of our vegetation communities over time. For example, this plot before the Woolsey Fire, shown here, to immediately post-fire. And remember how Carla mentioned that crown fires are the norm for our chaparral and coastal sage shrublands. And then a photo of the spring following the fire, then the fall, and then the second spring following the fire. I can also use this slide to show you that our plots consist of a 30-meter measuring tape running cross slope between two PVC rebar posts that you can see there in the one of which you can see in the foreground there, along and above which we collect cover, species richness, shrub density, and burn severity data, as well as tree density in those rare plots that we do have trees in the Santa Monicas. And then here in diagram form is our base vegetation monitoring protocol, shown here first on the left, with post-fire monitoring shown now on the right. There are two key changes to our protocol. We monitor all burn plots for 2 years following a fire, whether they are up in the rotation for survey or not, and we add supplemental fire-specific monitoring protocols. Here's a slide you can reference in the Zoom recording later, like some of my other slides. This one listing those vegetation features that we record. We have a robust study of burned versus unburned plots, covering 7 fires across our first 8 years in the monitoring program, shown in the table here. 2022 is our 9th year, with 2 additional fire footprints to monitor. One of the most noticeable early results following the Woolsey Fire, non-native mustards skyrocketed. However, we've documented significant native shrub resprouting and growth as well, starting with this rather bleak-looking scene 4 months post-fire to this just over 1 year later. See the person standing there? We measured hardy growth in native shrubs coming up from the seed bank as well, only overshadowed initially by the faster growing, abundant fire following perennial herbs. We found, though, that like several of my colleagues have mentioned throughout today, that the native vegetation recovery is highly dependent on rainfall patterns. Precipitation is graphed across years here, where our consecutive drought years in the last decade are obvious in comparison to well-timed rains right after the Woolsey fire, followed by severe drought last year. As a results example, we can look at our post-fire vegetation monitoring data spatially with these heat maps, where the darker green hues represent higher densities or cover. On the left two panels, the invasive non-native black mustard increases dramatically in the first year following the Woolsey fire, especially near the more urban Highway 101 corridor. On the right panels, the native fire-following subshrub deerweed took just 2 years to cover the ground after the Woolsey fire and rain, while it took 6 years to reach a similar extent after the 2013 Springs fire and drought. Okay, switching gears to our data collection that guides weed management around the park, tracking established weeds, as well as implementing an early detection and rapid response framework. We try to control other species as well, but these pictured here are our so-called Evil 25 weeds that we specifically monitor in our invasive plant monitoring program. These are all the sites in 2 different groups. First, the points of entry, which are trailheads and parking lots, shown in yellow. And second, the dirt, roads, and trails with randomly generated transects, shown in blue. These sites we surveyed for weeds following the Woolsey fire. We monitored about quadruple the number of sites following the fire compared to before. We really wanted to see how the fire was impacting weed recovery. Today, I'll share just what we found at the points of entry sites. In this series of pie charts, I'll bring this first one up here to get oriented. Watch the Dodger blue pie slice representing the proportion of points of entry sites with 0 target weed species. And also watch the red slice, which represents the 1 to 2 weed species per site category. Watch them get smaller over time, while the green slice, the proportion of sites with 3 to 5 weed species per site, gets bigger, especially in 2019 and 2020 following the Woolsey fire, when we also start to get 11 to 13 target weed species at some sites. So here we are starting in 2016. Watch again, the blue and red get smaller while the green gets bigger. 2016, 2017, 2018, and then after this season, the Woolsey fire happened. So here's first post-fire year 2019. And you see we start to pick up the category of sites with 11 to 13 weed species in 2020. So what can you do to help? One way is to contribute your sightings of invasive plants around the Santa Monica's and Simi Hills in our iNaturalist project. Just search for Evil 25. One of the reasons we do so much weed monitoring and restoration is to preserve and enhance our rare plant populations and keep our common native plants common. Every year we record dozens of rare plant observations, and we're also busy leading or partnering with folks on a handful of endangered plant recovery projects. For example, to monitor and boost populations of our park's rare Dudleya species, we're partnering with the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden's own conservation and research staff, along with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and San Jose State University. Those folks are pictured here, focusing on species such as this marcescent Dudleya. We also have a population expansion project for the federally endangered Lyon's pentakita, an endemic to the region. Another rare species that we've tracked and seen naturally expand in population sizes since the Woolsey fire, Bronton's milkvetch. Okay, but how did 2021 look after another winter with historically low rainfall? Not great. As you can see here from these spring 2020 photos, well, it's green here in 2020 compared to spring in 2021, quite a bit drier. And one more pair of photos. Here's 2020, following a couple good rain years. And here is dry 2021. But there were some surprises out there, like this giant yucca plant. And wildflower numbers were much lower, but still out there for finding, like these next few in Woolsey Burned Leo Carrillo State Park. Here's a favorite, chocolate lily to start. Shooting stars, prickly phlox, blue-eyed grass, paintbrush, to this gorgeous bush poppy in Unburned Topanga State Park. Speaking of Topanga, I mentioned that we have more recent fires to monitor as well. For example, last May's 1,200 acre Palisades fire. We had a remote camera next to one of our vegetation monitoring plots out there, and were able to capture the fire passing through. So here it is. But the camera, or at least the memory card, survived, allowing us to get those photos. And here's how that plot looked 1 month before the Palisades fire, and then a few days after. Rising from the ashes there, though, in 2022 are beauties like this stinging lupin, and the perennials seem to be resprouting well. Elsewhere in the Santa Monica's this year, in the Woolsey fire footprint, for example, and the Simi Hills, both looking fairly green following December's heavy rains. So it's green early in our 2022 monitoring season, and we just hope for a few more storms to sustain the plants further into the year. Aside from vegetation, we also conduct long-term and post-fire wildlife monitoring, focusing on groups such as amphibians, which can be particularly sensitive to changes in habitat conditions following fire, like Mo just hinted at with the steelhead. For example, one federally threatened species is the California red-legged frog, pictured at the bottom left. I agree wholly with Mo, it's a fantastic species to try and see. In our reintroduction project for the red-legged frog, we saw a drastic reduction in breeding habitat following the fire and its resulting mud and debris flows. We remain active with this important reintroduction and monitoring work. And yes, we also monitor the populations and behaviors of charismatic megafauna as post-fire habitat returns to the landscape. So what else can you do? Join one of our many planting or weeding events. Or if we're too far away, one from your local California Native Plant Society or Sierra Club chapter. So reach out to me or our fantastic restoration ecologist, Joey Algiers, or our experienced nursery manager, Antonio Sanchez, and we will gratefully connect you with a project that really makes a difference. Thank you very much for your attention and participation. I'll stop sharing.
Yay, thanks so much, Mark. You managed to make that fun, even though a lot of it was weeds. We don't have anything in the Q&A, but I'm curious how much volunteer support comes into the park. Do you have any numbers offhand or any idea?
I don't have any total numbers, but I do know that since the Woolsey fire, we've had events with as many as 500, 700 people, and we never had groups that big before the fire. So people are just tremendously invested in seeing and bringing the natives back. So it's yeah, that's the one silver lining, is that it's definitely increased the public, yeah, just volunteering their hours in their open spaces.
Oh, Carla says can't seem to ask questions. Oh, we have something come in. This just in. Can you talk about the amphibian responses to fire that you've seen?
Sure. So yeah, so following so the red-legged frog project, I'll just use that one as an example. The red-legged frogs were breeding in all of our reintroduction sites before the Woolsey fire, and we were very excited about that. And then the fire happened, and you know, as Mo showed you those pictures, it just totally, you know, filled in most of our breeding habitat for the frogs. And so very little breeding happened in 2019. 2020 was a little bit better, and 2021 better still. So it'll probably be a slow recovery to where we were just before the fire. And that pretty much holds true across the board, except for some species like the western toad actually increased in abundance. Yeah, so those are two I'd highlight.
Thanks, Mark. Carla entered hers into the chat. She said, what do you do about the mustard?
Yeah, that's probably one of her and my most frequent questions. We can't really do anything terrific on the regional scale, but at a local scale, we are starting to do things like timed mowing experiments, where we will get out there and with our ride-on mowers that we recently got through a nice grant, and we'll get out there and mow you know, before flowering, so that we can hopefully discourage mustards and annual grasses, reduce the seed bank for those species, and at the same time, you know, plant you know, hundreds, thousands of natives, and hopefully over time, you know, have those natives win out. But yeah, as you know, mustard's here to stay, as well as the non-native grasses, but we do work at a local scale, and we are starting to see some successes. I think you're muted, Denise. There you go.
Thanks. Thanks again, Mark, and especially for the hopeful messages about what we can all do, which we're going to continue on with our next speaker, Dr. Josie Lesage. She's our applied ecologist at Botanic Garden. She works to map, conserve, and restore California habitats using ecological theory as a guide. She has a PhD in environmental studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she studied long-term management and change in California's coastal forests. As the garden supply ecologist, she's interested in understanding how local ecosystems respond to disturbance and restoration intervention, and in building a community of volunteer scientists to steward our local habitats. So thanks so much, Josie. Take it away.
Denise and I are in the same room, so we're gonna have to be careful about not being on voice at the same time. Let me share my slides. Can I get a thumbs up if they're open, Denise? Great, okay. Hi everyone, as Denise mentioned, I'm Dr. Josie Lesage. I'm the applied ecologist at the Botanic Garden, and I'm excited to talk to you today about some of the ways that the public can be involved and contribute to post-fire mapping, monitoring, and understanding where restoration should occur. And also a huge thank you and congrats to Carla, who was one of my first mentors that sent me down this path. In addition to Carla, I want to thank everyone who has helped on our community science mapping projects. These were a huge lift and would not have happened without the help of many organizations, many volunteers, and many collaborators at the Botanic Garden and elsewhere. All right, So as you've heard numerous times today, a lot can happen on a landscape after fire. And one of the big things we want to know is whether the landscape is recovering and how it's recovering. So we have this question of, is the landscape converting to a grassland? Is it recovering slowly? Is it bouncing right back? Do we see significant changes that are concerning or not? And the question is really, how do we know? And as scientists, we collect data. So these are some great photos of projects that the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden has done in the past of us going out and collecting data. You can see that we like to get really overloaded with field equipment and then walk out on a trail and find out what's going on post-fire. But fires are getting bigger and bigger, and more acres are burning across California each year. So this is a chart. On the x-axis, we have years starting in 1987 and going to 2021. And on the y-axis, we have the number of acres that are burned each of those years in California by wildfire. And what you can see is that from the late 80s, early 90s up to 2020, we have 2020 was actually, an order of magnitude 10 times as many acres burned as is typical, or as was typical in the early 90s. So a huge, huge increase in the amount of area that is going to require post-fire monitoring. And so a question becomes, how could we possibly survey all of that land? And I think one of the key answers is with the help of volunteer scientists. So citizen science or community science, also just thought of as science that is conducted all or in part by people who are not professional scientists. So anyone who wants to contribute to science who doesn't do that as part of their day job, really. You can do that now. There's so many ways to volunteer and to help collect data. And essentially anyone with a smartphone that can take a photo and record a GPS point can collect valuable spatial plant location and photos. And there are now a number of apps that are super helpful for getting these data back out to scientists. So one of those is iNaturalist. And I have become a complete shill for this wonderful, wonderful app and community. iNaturalist is easy to use, it's beginner friendly, it's a quick download. There's a huge community on iNat who do data verification and who will provide really helpful comments. If you take a photo of a plant, they'll let you know, oh, I actually think it's something else because of this feature. It's a wonderful way to learn about plants, bees, birds, anything in your local habitat you can learn about using iNaturalist. And what's really, really cool about it is that all of this data is then available to scientists to use for other purposes. And so there are a number of iNaturalist projects that are specifically tied to post-fire monitoring. Many local agencies and organizations like museums and botanic gardens will make post-fire monitoring projects. I cannot thank Mark enough for showing that they have exactly that for the Evil 25. CNPS, the California Native Plant Society, also has something like this as their Fire Followers program, where they're showing or where they're collecting data about all of the fires in California. So there is a project for each fire scar. And this is something that we have also done at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. So we surveyed in the Thomas and Whittier fire scars using iNaturalist. And for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those findings. So our goals with our fire survey using iNaturalist and another app were to survey fire scars to prioritize which areas might be in need of restoration based on the data we collected. So we were attempting to map invasive species, map rare species, identify areas that were in need of restoration, whether there was erosion occurring, whether there was signs that there were no native species returning to a landscape, or if there were some other signs of environmental damage. Another goal of this project was really to build up and engage a community of volunteer scientists who would be in our backyard and who would be able to help us collect data, and then to test the effectiveness of the data collected by volunteers and by staff, and to get a sense of, are these data interchangeable? And can we just start mobilizing huge swaths of volunteers statewide? As a part of our training for our volunteers. We did surveys in spring and summer of 2020 and 2021. And we had classroom and field trainings where we had folks download the apps, we trained them on how to use the apps, and we did some really basic plant ID guidance. You'll notice that, or if you can think back to what spring 2020 was like, there was this really big thing that happened in March where a pandemic came around. And so we ended up, even though we had across both years, almost 300 people signed up, as with any volunteer program, we had some attrition, and we had in total 101 volunteers collect data across both years, with 7 repeat participants from 2020 and 2021. And these volunteers had a range of botanical skill levels. So we had folks who were just starting to realize that there are plants on the landscape and that they had different identities and learning how to ID them, to people who were very familiar with dichotomous keys and could tell you what a grass is on site. And each of these volunteers was assigned a trail to hike and was able to choose whether they wanted to look for 12 or 24 invasive species. Most of our surveying occurred in the Thomas Fire Scar, and I'm showing a map here. If it helps to see, Santa Barbara is down here, Montecito, and then Ojai. We focused on the Forest Service areas within the Thomas Fire Scar, and we attempted to hike all maintained and accessible routes for our surveying. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on the area above Santa Barbara in the front country there, because that is our area of largest and most concentrated volunteer contribution. So on to our results. If those of you, or if anyone on this is familiar with Santa Barbara, this is from the Romero Canyon Trail. You can see the obvious burn areas. All right, so our volunteers collectively contributed over 1,400 hours to the project. Training is a huge component of this, and this number is an estimate, but we had roughly almost 1,000 hours contributed through training, and then at least 400 hours contributed through the surveying itself. So a huge amount of time to produce a huge amount of data. So collectively, staff and volunteers collected over 5,000 observations of all of the plants, or many different plants that were occurring in these fire scars. So once again, this is a map of our study region. The lines in blue, orange, and brown are showing routes, and the kind of beigeish color is the fire scar itself. And all of these orange dots represent a point of volunteer plant data that was collected. So volunteers effectively collected data over all of the trails that we sent them to. And zooming in now on Santa Barbara, we're going to look at the invasive species data they collected. So this is now zoomed in to just the long stretch of burn scar above the Santa Barbara front country. And these orange dots represent all species. We encouraged our volunteers to collect data about any plants they were interested in, not just the focal species. And so of these, roughly half were for the focal species. So one thing I think that came out of this project for me was that a lot of people who got out, once they had their INAT app and they were looking at plants, found a lot of plants that they were interested in that weren't necessarily our focal invasive species. In some cases, these might have been misidentifications of a non-weed as a potential weed, but I think in a lot of cases, people just found cool plants and wanted to record them on INAT. If we remove the non-focal invasive species, you can still see that there's a huge amount of data that was added. And so I'm going to just sort of zoom in on a couple little quick case studies. If we break this map down by the species that are present, 2 quick things. These bright green dots are all fennel, Feniculum vulgare. And this is a fairly large plant, easy to see, and was well represented in the volunteer data, as was tree tobacco in the light blue. And what this indicates to me is that volunteer scientists are very good at identifying large and kind of showy plants when they're on the landscape. Another plant that volunteers were super helpful at identifying and recording location data for was Ageratina adenophora, which is this cute little invasive. It's always a bummer when they're cute. That's been found a few times in Santa Barbara. So this is all records of this plant from herbarium specimens and some spatial data or some GPS point data prior to our project. And if you were to look at this map, you might think, okay, there's a handful of these plants in our local creeks, but maybe it's something that's still at a manageable point and we could go out and remove them from these isolated areas. After we had our data collection period, you'll see that staff and volunteers found huge amounts of this going almost all the way up into these watersheds. And so what this indicates is that this is not actually at a stage where it's manageable, it's probably a bit beyond that point. I also think these are just cool pictures to compare the staff and the volunteer scientist data. So we've got here the same exact plant recorded at 2 different periods, in March by a community scientist and in April by staff. And the same for this fennel. You can see from this little corrugated metal here, this is the same plant that was seen twice in one season. So staff and community scientists sometimes recorded the same plants, which I think is super cool. This project was also a really unique opportunity to collect data about fire followers. These are plants that appear after a fire and respond dramatically. They'll flush their seed bank, they'll cover a slope, and they only appear after fire typically. And so getting out onto the landscape and identifying where they are is something that can only happen in that short period following fire. So getting out with your phone and collecting data, mobilizing a huge amount of people is a great way to identify where these things are appearing on the landscape, since they're not really going to be present that much after the fire. And then finally, for rare species, we collected a ton of rare species data. So this is known populations already present on the landscape, all these little purple triangles. And between staff and volunteers, we confirmed or added over 200 populations of rare plants, which again, just goes to show how much data can be added. And finally, I'm gonna call out one volunteer in particular, George Williams, who did an amazing job of identifying this rare plant, Monardella hypoleuca. He posted it and I got really excited about it. This is a species that was described in 2015 or subspecies. At that point, only 59 specimen records of this plant existed, or sorry, only 59 specimen records exist now. George found over 83 observations. He's still recording them. And I think that's just amazing that one person he's a trail runner who likes to go out, has been able to add so much data about where this species is. And from what I can tell, it seems to really like these sort of burned, rocky, open areas. So collecting data, anybody can do it, and it can be really useful. So I just want to conclude with volunteer scientist data can inform many questions about invasive species arrival and their spread post-fire, where rare species are occurring, where fire followers appear and which fire followers appear in an area, where recovery is slower or faster, and lots more that I'm sure we did not tap very well in this project, but future projects will be able to tap into. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh, will this work if I was going to come talk through your mic?
I don't know if everyone can hear you.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. I'll mute myself while you ask questions.
Oh. Okay. Technical issues, since we're in the same room, trying not to reverb on you. 2 questions for you from, oh good, thank goodness. From Joanna Tang. She asks, Josie, how do you feel about your volunteer retention rate? Can you elaborate on the cost of training or tips for how to maximize training and retention?
Yeah, so how do I feel about it? I actually feel great about it. I think having roughly 1/3 of all volunteers stick around and collect data is pretty great, especially given the pandemic. In the first year of the surveying work, I was really great about sending updates. And I think that sort of connection to volunteers is really important to retention. So in my first year, I sent almost a monthly update saying, like, hey, this is starting to bloom, or start looking for these weeds. ID tips if you were looking for Centaurea melitensis and Centaurea solstitialis, how to tell them apart. And so I think that, for any volunteer project, there's always going to be a large amount of drop off. And I think one of the things that I think is something to consider is that in the future, if you've got the training materials already prepared, the time investment to train volunteers is going to sort of flatten out over time because you already have the materials. You might be adding or removing a species every year, but the contribution that volunteers can give is going to remain very, very high, right? If folks are still out hiking, they're going to collect a lot of data for you. So we're crunching the numbers right now. And I think for our 2 years of surveying, the time contribution that it took from staff was about the same monetarily. I think it came out to $11,000 for all training. And if you value the volunteer time at about $25,000 or $25 an hour, it was about the same level or the same financial. So basically a 100% return on investment. But I don't have those numbers on me right now, but send an email to me and I'm happy to expand.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question. You mentioned staff and volunteers logging the same plant. How do you correct for duplicate data points?
That's a great question. So we ended up importing all of the data into ArcGIS and then running some somewhat complicated geoprocessing on them to say, if there are this many dots within a certain area, merge that into one large polygon. Our volunteers, I didn't go into it in this talk, but our volunteers also collected data about how many plants there were and what amount of area it covered in square meters. And so all of those numbers were crunched together to eventually aggregate them into a polygon. So there's a bit of complication there.
Right on. Thanks so much, Josie. Well done. And don't worry, I'm recording the other questions to address in the panel discussions. So, what just happened? We're going to end by zooming back out to the big scale with our last speaker, Dr. Max Moritz. He is a cooperative extension wildfire specialist for the University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. He's also an adjunct professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara and an affiliate of the Earth Research Institute. His research focuses on understanding the dynamics of fire regimes at relatively broad scales, and his extension work involves applying this information to planning, management, and policy relevant to fire-prone landscapes. So Max, take it away.
I'm going to turn my camera off in a second because our bandwidth is bad here, but I wanted to continue the pattern of saying thank you to the organizers, and Denise in particular, to the previous speakers who have given some really interesting talks. And also, I'm honored to be here celebrating Carla, who I'm happy to consider a colleague, a role model, and a friend. All right. I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about where and how we live on fire-prone landscapes. So I'm going to start it off with some fire science, fire ecology related research to say why I've been motivated to move in this direction. But it's kind of obvious. We have what we see on this intro screen here is becoming more and more common. The top is from the Angora fire around Tahoe about 15 years ago, and the bottom is the result of the Camp Fire in Paradise just a few years ago. But this increasing pattern of home loss and fatalities that we're seeing, and what can we possibly do to get a handle on it? Because fires come out of our wildlands and impact us as people, and then we are often the start of many of these fires, kind of emerging from our communities and affecting the fire ecology of these systems. If you've done any study or seen talks on fire, you've probably seen the fire behavior triangle. Basically, if you want to understand the flame lengths or rates of spread or frequencies of a given fire, it's often boiled down to weather, fuel, and topography. But over longer time scales and broader spatial scales, Carla showed a slide somewhat like this. Fire sweeps across the planet every year in different months, and some years are different than others. But looking at the fire patterns like this, fire regimes, leads to a different set of questions and a different set of insights. And that's what I've actually spent most of the last 2 decades working on. From that work, we've kind of come up with 3 bins of controls on fire regimes. So the sets of variables that control fuel amount first. So productivity, plant productivity, really. What are the biophysical variables that make one environment more productive and fuel to accumulate faster than another? And those are different variables in different environments. The fire season, there has to be a length of time in which whatever is on the ground, whatever biomass there is actually flammable. So there's another set of variables that control the length and severity of that window, promoting flammability. And then you have to have ignitions that coincide with these to actually have recurring fire. And I've spent a lot of time at broad scales doing this, but when we've zoomed into California and started trying to do this, what we see here is about 50 years of fire in the little orange blobs over the ecoregions of California. When you zoom into finer scales, you start to realize that those bioclimatic variables don't necessarily tell the whole story anymore. So we've built a bunch of fire models for CAL FIRE, and they actually use these as the model of record in some of their programs. We realized you cannot leave people out of these analyses. You have to include patterns of things like the power line infrastructure across the state. Other anthropogenic variables like road network, the housing densities, and so on, all have to go into the models, or we don't get the patterns right. And we've learned a lot. Some of the more interesting things that we've learned is that you can break the sensitivity of fire activity on the landscape through the models. You can break it into the natural biophysical variables. And this is a map showing kind of the partial dependence of fire activity to the biophysical variables. And then in the model, you can segregate and isolate bin the anthropogenic, the human-related variables. And you learn some really interesting things. One is that in many parts of the landscape up and down the state, the human variables are as strong or stronger than the biophysical variables affecting fire activity. And it's also, it can be a positive or a negative effect. And that's because we actually can increase ignitions or we can decrease fire for various reasons. And this is one of the model results. This is a sort of a functional response curve of fire activity, how strong the effect is on fire activity. The variable being on the x-axis, mean housing density. So we see that there is this hump-shaped and probably very general response that fire activity has to housing densities. And the way to interpret this is there's some background level of fire at very low housing densities, right? And then as you sprinkle homes onto a landscape, you increase ignitions, increase fire activity. And then you continue to develop, and finally you've fragmented up the landscape. There's not as much, as many expanses of flammable native vegetation. And then finally you're out here in these very high densities, and you're in a very urban environment where you've got organized fire suppression, and fire just doesn't play as strong a role. But this effect shows us something that we can do with policy, right? Where and how we build our communities on the landscape defines our exposure to fire, right? And how likely it is that fires are going to hit those developed areas. But it also feeds back to affect fire frequencies themselves. So actually, as we wrestle with climate change, we also have a really important lever through landscape and urban planning to affect not only our exposure and our risk, but also future fire frequencies. I spent a fair amount of time, and this took me into an area that I have less comfort as a researcher and scientist, because I'm not an urban planner. I'm not a landscape architect, but there's a real gap in the literature about how can you build new communities to make them more survivable? What are the things that we have learned from research, which actually there's not a lot out there, and from other countries, largely Australia, to help us do this better in the future? A couple of just real simple examples that came from interviews with planners and fire professionals. When you're building a new community, don't put homes on the outer perimeter road of the development. Pack them into the interior so that you have a sidewalk, a full street width, a sidewalk, and a yard before you actually, before the fire coming from outside this community hits a structure. Simple, simple, but hard to actually get developers to do unless you're very strong about encouraging or stipulating it. Instead of typical urban sprawl, like we see in this panel, the rectangular gridded neighborhood, this cartoon is supposed to be an older traditional neighborhood, but the sprawl has, as this has developed and expanded outward, it's low density, right? It's lower cul-de-sacs, lower, more widely spaced homes, which eats up a lot of this darker native habitat, and it eats up this hatched area, which is supposed to represent farmland, right? In contrast, clustered development could result in the same number of homes, less native habitat eaten up, and more of this agricultural land, which is acting as kind of a buffer against fire, reaching our wildland urban interface, reaching where we live. Now that's for new communities. What about existing communities? And here's where I want to talk about this regional wildfire mitigation program, which we've started here locally. There are thousands and thousands of communities out there that are in dire need of some sort of coherent synthetic approach to risk mitigation. And we really do not have one right now that makes a real strong impact. And that's my argument. And this comes from many years of looking at community wildfire protection plans and other communities grappling with these problems. So the regional wildfire mitigation program approach breaks out 3 domains: the landscape, the community, and the built environment. And I'll touch on a little bit of those here and show you some preliminary results from our own program here, which has been funded by NIFWIF, and we have a wide set of partners helping us push this forward. Community wildfire protection plans are what most people think of when they think of risk reduction on the community side. While these are really helpful, they focus mostly on where to put fuel breaks. There is some collaborative effort and there's some mention of structure hardening, but really it's about where to prioritize fuel breaks. And in our backyard, we have 6 community wildfire protection plans. Some of them are very small, just covering, say, Mission Canyon, and another one is at the San Marcos Pass communities, and some of them are larger, like Carp Summerlin, Montecito, Santa Barbara City, Goleta. But these are all uncoordinated or basically disconnected. Some are different sizes, produced at different times, and they don't coordinate or talk to each other in a meaningful way. So our landscape here, if you look at it, we have some interesting patterns here. We've got this kind of lighter green shade over here on the eastern part of our landscape, and then some of that same green and a little bit of this yellow. That's ag. That's the existing ag belt, which has actually saved many of these communities from fire sweeping out of the front country and into those communities. And where that ag is gone or never existed, above Santa Barbara and Montecito primarily, that's where we experience most of our home losses. So with this as sort of our backdrop, we embarked on a regional wildfire mitigation program. The built environment, most people think of structures, and that is a key thing that we're trying to map and analyze. Fire-resistant roofs and siding and well-maintained vegetation is certainly important, but it goes beyond that. It involves the water supplies, the road networks, and the power line infrastructure. All of those contribute to a survivable and relatively fire-resistant built environments. We're basically cataloging and mapping all of that. Ag, here's a picture of some ag down in Ventura that was helpful in stopping, I think, the Thomas Fire. This is, I owe some of these photos to other collaborators. This is from Rob Hazard. Clearly the ag belt above Santa Barbara, where it is there, it would be nice to lock it down when we're considering it a buffer anyway. The other areas where there is no ag, there's a bunch of other options. There's shaded fuel breaks of coast live oak. That's part of the project that the Botanic Garden is working on. There's irrigated green spaces. There's riparian areas. There's any number of different ways that we can think of a buffer along the wildland urban interface. And we're mapping and trying to understand the best options for that across the front country too. There's people, right? There's the community, getting people plugged into training and education programs. Specifically, we've bought into the Firewise USA program, which after your community becomes recognized, it does have some advantages for several insurance companies. This is from a Ventura exercise after some fires down there. But those are the three basic pillars or the three domains of the project. We have a methodology. We have a fairly organized and explicit process for each of the domains. We have a pretty sophisticated risk assessment where we do hazard modeling under a variety of different weather conditions, and then use that hazard map, as you'll see in a second, as a basis for understanding what the exposure is of the resources and the values that we have in these three domains, what their exposure is, and try to figure out how to map their vulnerabilities and that exposure in a way that gives us some steps toward prioritization of mitigation activities. So the wind data that we're using is simulated from some colleagues at UCSB, Charles Jones and Leila Carvalho. And it takes basically two different kinds of sundowner events and makes a composite sundowner as our sort of problem fire, runs it through a fire model, creates a whole, many thousands of surfaces of fire probability and flame lengths and so on. And here's one of the results of that. This is burn probability. And it's looked at through these different watersheds across the front country. And the white, which may be hard to see, that the words in white are our different communities, which we'll actually, we'll see in a second. Those were watersheds, I apologize, or sub-watersheds. These are the defined communities we have so far. This will probably evolve somewhat, but these are the communities that we are organizing and trying to plug into Firewise USA, but they're also a useful unit to actually look at exposure, right, to the different levels of fire hazard, which we see on the colors on the map here. And using some other data, the structure inspection data from Santa Barbara County Fire and some remote sensing data from Mark Mays, one of our key folks on the project, we can look at something like this, which tells us the y-axis here is sort of the greenness. How buffered is each of these communities on a 5-year mean on average? And on the x-axis here, we have something that tells us how fire resistant the roofing it might be. Over here, the same, on the right-hand panel, the same figure, but the x-axis is how fire resistant the siding might be. And the different colors, the darker and darker red, tells us how much exposure to hazard these different communities have, and the size of the dots is the number of homes. So we're starting to get a handle on how we might characterize some of the data. These are preliminary results, which will lead us into the mitigation part, how to prioritize mitigation activities based on what we're finding and where to apply those resources. We also have in the community domain, we've accomplished, I say we, it's Anne Marie Parkinson, who's leading the community domain, and she's an employee of the Fire Safe Council, who's deeply involved in this. The Trout Club, the county's first recognized Firewise USA program. So we're very proud that we're we're actually not just finding some preliminary data and have good funding for this, but we're actually making some progress in getting these communities educated and plugged in. There's a website, rwmpsantabarbara.org. If you want to learn more. Again, the Fire Safe Council is deeply involved. Even though it started outside the Fire Safe Council, and it's very well funded right now from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWF, which funded some of the earlier projects we heard about. As the Fire Safe Council moves forward, we will need to find additional sources and additional partners. Right now, it's it's really a broad collaboration between a whole bunch of different organizations that all deserve credit on getting this going. And it will probably expand as we continue. And so once we've pioneered it here, our hope is that, like Firewise, as it spreads across the country and plugs in more and more communities, we will have regional wildfire mitigation programs popping up and happening in other places, because there's a lot of parts of the West that need some sort of an approach. And so I'm hoping that this is going to fill that need, or partly fill that need. And that's all I had. Okay. Hopefully, if there are any questions, I would do my best.
Max, where are you? Can you pull up your video?
Where am I? I'm in my messy den.
Oh, sorry. It was really great to loop back around to the people and our communities, and like what's that part of the equation. So it's really great to think about. We have one question in the Q&A, and it's a challenging one. You talk about the importance of agricultural areas as buffers against fire spread into residential areas. However, by converting natural to ag lands or maintaining ag lands, you're diminishing native habitats and native plant biodiversity. Agricultural development is often accompanied by the use of biocides, fertilizer, and water, which put further strains on our local environment. Is this such a good idea if you want to maintain native species and biodiversity?
Great, very, very important point. And I don't think any of us are advocating to take large swaths of the front country and turn it into commercial ag, right? That's not, it's not going to happen. There's not enough water for it. But where we do have ag that is going to be there and it's going to be operational, and it's providing a function that is pretty under-recognized and undervalued, I think that we as a society need to think hard about that. And if we can have ag that's less impactful from a, like you're saying, from a pesticide and biodiversity perspective, that's really important. But the fact of the matter is, without that ag there, if we were to let it go, these would be probably kind of weedy, they'd be weedy grasslands, right? And that's not a great option either, because that's neither native habitat, nor is it providing any sort of a buffer against fires coming in and impacting our lives. So it is a trade-off. There are lots and lots of things that are trade-offs that we have to go into with eyes wide open.
Be careful about muting. Yeah, for sure. Here's another one for you, Max. How do you make sure that your research gets translated into policy? And can you give an example of a city planning project that took into account design of defensible?
Wow, that's painful, but yeah, that's a great question. I think one really good example, one really sad example, is that I worked for probably 3 years on a bill that came out of Hannah Beth Jackson's office, and it got bipartisan support. It finally passed, and then the governor didn't sign it. And it was a really progressive. There's a bunch of reasons why it didn't get signed, but I mean, it had support. It had a lot of people that worked hard on it. So I guess the story there is that it's really tough. It's really, really tough to get research into policy. There's so many barriers that have nothing to do with science, zero. So it's challenging. It's just persistence, perseverance. There is, though, the example of Paradise. When Paradise burned up north and they were rebuilding Paradise, the Parks and Rec department took an active role in trying to buy up some of the parcels that had burned and actually incorporate them into the park system and turn them into more of a buffer, an irrigated green belt, if you will, to help, to help protect the town. So it does happen. There's also the Gaviota Coast Plan. If you look at the Gaviota Coast Plan, it's written in there that development should be concentrated on the lowest hazard portion of the landscape, right? And avoid the high hazard part. So there are examples of it happening. It's just not enough.
Yeah, understood. We all just got to try, right? So at this point, I'm going to invite all the panelists to turn on their videos. Thank you so much, Max. We're going to start the panel discussion. And I'd like to, while everyone's doing that, just remind everyone to enter your questions into the Q&A rather than the chat. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat anymore. But I did collect a few questions from earlier as we get new questions coming in. So here we go. Actually, let's start with this one. Why not just let the landscape go back on its own?
Well, I'm happy to make a stab at that. And I want to make reference right away to the analysis that Shane and Nicole and I were engaged in Ventura County of looking at change using aerial photos since the 1930s. And it seems that areas that began as grassland and converted to grassland stay grassland. So these non-native grasslands, once they form, are pretty persistent as a vegetation type, probably because of the dense litter that accumulates that suppresses germination of other things. So, I do think, and we've seen it a little bit in aerial photos of our Piru study site, that some species, like some of the sage scrub species, like Artemisia and stuff that disperse pretty widely on their own, will slowly find places to establish in the landscape. But it's a pretty slow process. And these grasslands are really persistent features of the landscape. So, and that's certainly like in Hawaii, we surveyed sites that burned once in a high intensity grass fire 40 years ago, and they didn't recover. So natural recovery just doesn't really happen in the face of these really dense invasive grasses. So that's why we can't just let it stay on its own if we want to have any of these diverse values. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump.
Yeah, I think Carla hit the nail on the head. I can just add, along with the fact that most of the chaparral species can't really disperse back in, and the sage shrub species that do and can start to establish, like Carla said, are slow to reestablish. And also, as she mentioned, the grasses are extremely flashy, and there's a high probability that they'll ignite. They'll keep maintaining that fire return interval that won't allow the sage scrub to start to dominate and outshape them. And so they really are extremely effective at creating positive feedback loops that coincide with their persistence.
I guess I would add it highlights the importance of what Nicole was showing us, because we can't restore everything, right? With limited resources. And there are ways to highlight which parts of the landscape are a better bet. At least that's the message I took away. And I thought that was kind of encouraging.
So here's one from early on in the symposium. Is it possible for humans to make a difference in restoration when the areas are so massive?
I can take that one. With the chaparral work we do, I think it is. I think it's promising. You might see our percent survival at around 10% total and think that that's pretty dismal. It's not great. But if you think about the percent survival of these species naturally post-fire, it's probably orders of magnitude lower. When they have an established seed bank, there's just thousands of seedlings that reestablish in extremely high density. and only a couple of those survive and reach maturity, but then those create the cover. And if you think about our 6-acre project where we've been working and we've had about 10% survival, the 10% that are out there they look great. We have some Sambucus that's taller than me. We have that black sage I showed you that has flowered 2 years in a row now. We have a bunch of Encelias that have flowered 2 years in a row now. And this is only 2 years in the project. If you think about those shrubs that do survive and keep growing, it's a slow process, but it's different. There's now significantly more native cover on that slope than there was before. Anecdotally, there's a lot more bird activity there than there used to be. I learned firsthand to my detriment that those plants create animal cover. I found a rattlesnake under one. And so, yeah, I think that we can make a difference. And like, it might be slower than we'd like it to be. And the numbers themselves might not be super flashy, but I think those slopes where we've worked are improved for that effort.
Thanks, Shane. Anyone else want to take that, or should I go to the next question?
Denise, I'll just jump in real quick to tie this back maybe to one of the concepts that came up in several of the presentations today of climate change refugia. We published a special issue on this topic a couple years ago, and one of the ways we framed that was sort of as stepping stones for ecosystems into the future. So you don't need to have the chaparral and coastal sage species, especially those that are really restricted in their ranges, across all the landscape. It's just not going to be possible. There's going to be too much change in the future. But if we can provide some of those stepping stones to keep them around long enough into the future, that we can provide that persistence that they need, that has been key areas and critical for past climate changes as well. And so continuing to preserve smaller parts of the landscape is going to be, those smaller efforts are going to have high reward.
There's actually something that I wanted to do kind of interactive with the crowd out there. If we can try to recount what some of the lessons are from all the different talks about what we can do, if you can type that into the chat, what all of us can do, let's remind ourselves that there are actually a number of things we can all do to help. So we'll turn on the chat and let's see. Anybody still out there?
You are giving us some big feedback. Hard to hear.
Okay, we're going to try something new. I'm going to go over towards Josie.
Oh boy. What? Okay. You'll still show up on your screen if you.
That's true. So I'm just going to talk through yours. Is that right? How is that, everybody? Is that a little better?
That's way better. Yeah.
Okay, good. I think Josie's microphone is better than mine. So what I wanted to do actually is to ask all of the participants just to try to recount some of the things that we can all do that were laid out in the various talks. Could you do that for me? Enter those things in the chat. Oh, great. Some people did hear me. Okay, this is awesome. Break the seed cycle of invasives. We can work on our own properties. We can clean weed seeds, harden homes, community science and restoration projects, participate, get biocontrol, nice. Educate people, spread the word, harden our homes, advocate, Those are all really great. Yeah, so there's a lot we can do. All right, I'm going to move on to the other questions in the Q&A. This one's for Nicole. Have you overlaid your lower regenerative areas with human impact or roads, other human infrastructure, power lines, wildland urban interface, etc.?
So the sort of the model that I shared with you is really focusing on sort of the ecological constraints to recovery. And so the idea is then to take that map and to overlay it with proximity to roads, with potential future disturbances, and take some of those more sort of less ecological factors and integrate those into the mapping effort to start deciding, okay, where is restoration actually feasible? What parts of these landscapes can we access? And then what kind of stresses will continue to potentially affect those restored landscapes through time, and that will help us decide where or what kind of restoration should happen on those lands. So yes, that's the second part in what we do that I didn't have time to go over, but that's an important piece.
Thanks, Nicole. Here's the next one. Could the panel discuss the issues with the location and extent of fuel breaks? Won't the creation of fuel breaks cause type conversion, creating corridors of weeds and exotic grasses that are more prone to fire ignitions?
Well, that is a challenging issue. Certainly, if you go up on the field breaks above the city of Santa Barbara, that is what you see. And there's such extensive field breaks that it's very hard to manage them every year and keep them mowed down and keep the fuel load down. So I think that's a big challenge. And Nicole can address this, but the Forest Service does intend to let some field breaks go back towards more native vegetation and be abandoned. And I think the most critical issue is to identify where strategic field breaks are, maintain those, and that is not let them turn into corridors of yellow star thistle and invasive grasses, and try to have some ecological value to them. And that leads to a project that one of my students is doing, Robert Fitch, in collaboration with Nicole, and that's trying to create more ecologically sustainable field breaks. And if you look at the graph I showed of live fuel moisture of the exotic annual grasses compared to our native perennial grasses, you see our native perennial grasses maintain live fuel moisture above the critical threshold where fires become fairly large. They do it much better all the way into the summer, into late summer. So maybe we need to revegetate our field breaks and maintain them with more native vegetation that doesn't build a lot of fuel, but maintains a better live fuel moisture. So that would be a goal, is to have more ecological field breaks. Nicole, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would, that's exactly right, Carla. And this idea is gaining a lot of momentum. And so Carla's student, Robert, is really the one who is pushing this forward. For those of you who spend time in the front country and you've driven down East Camino Cielo lately, you might see some areas where Robert is attempting to take some of these maintained fuel breaks and add native species. So native species, as Carla said, that can promote live fuel moisture, higher live fuel moisture into the summer and fall when we have the most ignitions, but also can provide some just ecological functions. So we're looking at planting species that could really help with pollinator services, for example. And so we have the project going on the Los Padres National Forest, and we recently got funding on the Cleveland National Forest to do another project that mirrors the one happening up here. And so if these two pilot projects, if we could show that there is proof of concept, I really think that this is going to be the direction, at least that the Forest Service is very interested in moving forward. We recognize the importance of fuel breaks, especially in the strategic locations in the WUI. or in the wildland urban interface. And so I don't see fuel breaks going anywhere or disappearing. I do think that they're strategically important during fire suppression in certain places, but what we can do is try to enhance the ecological function and sort of the quality of those fuel breaks. And so, you know, it's, again, Max brought up earlier, it's this trade-off, and it's recognizing a trade-off that's needed and trying to find the best possible solution, which is native species in these sort of augmented or altered conditions.
That's great. Thanks, Nicole. I also was wondering, Aaron and Michelle, you guys talked about the big cone Douglas fir, and it, you know, it looks kind of dire for that species. Can you all talk about recovery efforts and things you've learned about how to keep the species going?
Michelle, is there anything you wanted to jump in on there?
I mean, I'm not sure if I would say that it's dire, only that it has to be that the restoration plan should take into consideration some of the science that we're learning about the difference between, for instance, the coastal influence on the coastal populations and some of the interior influence. So things like tree rings can provide a much deeper in-depth analysis of how the tree growth is responding to climate over time, and seek more favorable habitat from that analysis that we've done. So yeah, I would say that you know, what we're doing is we're leading this into a niche modeling of climate refugia for big cones, so that we can help inform active restoration plans. And of course, there will continue to be passive restoration on the landscape as well as seeding occurs. But as was mentioned earlier, they do take a while to seed. These trees don't seed until they're in their 40th year, at least, on the landscape. So when we do have young trees, if they're extirpated by wildfire, that does make it a dire situation. But in other cases, these are long-lived trees, and they're likely to persist. I mean, given that they're one of the most fire resilient and drought tolerant species in all of North America. Aaron, did you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I think we're always on the lookout for the silver lining with data sets like these. But I mean, the reality is that we are in a period of rapid anthropogenic climate change. And you know, a lot of the data does point to increasing challenges for a lot of our native species. But we made a strong effort with this project, I think, all throughout, to really focus on mechanisms of resilience, or things that we think might allow big cone to persist in this landscape going forward. And some of those we've mentioned already. The climate refugia, you know, concept is a really critical one for this species, since it's even within its larger range, it still is really restricted in the topographic positions that it inhabits. So it really requires certain microsite conditions that will be important to identify in restoration efforts. And I'll also just point out, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but part of this project is active outplanting and restoration efforts with big cone that Carla D'Antonio's group is leading. And there's some really interesting lessons from that project already that I think are going to continue to inform our efforts to restore big cone.
Yeah, I'll add to that. We have had some success. We've put over close to a couple thousand seedlings out on the landscape in sites that burned in the Zaka fire in different severities. And, you know, we have less than 10% survival overall, but again, this is during a pretty extreme drought period. So, and some of the trees are actually doing really well. So we found out some things about landscape position and planting, particularly that you need, if you have even the slightest bit of microsite protection, such as a log nearby or a rock nearby, you have a much higher chance of that seedling surviving. So there seem to be little things you can do to enhance survival. And then one of my colleagues at UCSB, Ryoko Ono, is doing some interesting work in her lab on the role of the microbiome. So the symbionts that live in the plant needles, in particular, in helping with drought tolerance for these seedlings that we are outplanting to the field. So when we got seedlings initially, we got them from the Forest Service, grown in a generic lab where they were just exposed to whatever the generic greenhouse conditions were. And we have evidence now that those the microbiome that establishes in that condition is not as good as the microbial associations if you get them from big cone needles out in the field and then infect your plants before you put them out there. So you can do things. We're hoping to really nail this down in the next year, but it seems that you can do some things to help promote the survival of your seedlings before you even put them out in the field by getting the right microbiome. So.
Okay, here's a new question. Can the panelists talk about identifying restoration goals, especially given a changing climate? How do you decide on desirable species? And is native species turnover important and bet hedging, or are you only looking for one suite of native species?
Well, I think that, you know, the approach we've taken, like at Piru, is to not focus, like the easy suite of species, I think, would be all the sage scrub species, because we can find them fairly readily around there, and they make a fair amount of seed, so it's easy to get their seed. They're easier to germinate than chaparral species. So if we just wanted easy, we'd stick with those, but we want diversity. So, you know, I think your question is totally right on that. You want a diverse group of species because you want an adaptive community that's going to be able to survive no matter what comes. And that might mean that some of your planted species last 5 to 10 years and drop out. And some of your species that are initially not doing that well increase as the climate changes, or, you know, whatever those conditions are. So, you know, ideally you want some diversity because that's going to help with your long-term adaptation of the community to the fire setting. How do we get that? You know, how far do we look? We kind of limited ourselves in our selection of species to the greater watershed. But the garden is doing a project in the same area, and they're using a wider array of species. And we didn't quite look quite as wide as they did, but, you know, maybe that's the way to go. You know, I don't know that there's a right answer to this question of how far do you go to get your suite of your palette from which you're going to choose. Now, maybe you guys at the garden can comment on why you went with such a wider pool than we went with.
One of the things that I think has been a struggle point is seed availability or plant availability. There's just right now such a huge limit on what is available as far as local genetics, as far as, I mean, even just beyond local genetics, what species are available to purchase. A lot of restoration, if you want a diverse palette of plants, you need to do the seed collection and the grow out yourself. And so I think that that's a huge struggle point that restoration as a whole is going to need to overcome. And I also see a big gap in a lot of the really fun little annuals don't have great seed out there. So if I wanted to plant like a Europapis lindleyi, a silver puff, I don't know where I would get seed for that unless I were able to collect it myself. And there's such ephemeral little cute plants that it's a lot of effort for those kinds of things to make it into restoration. And I hope we see that in the future.
I think I'd add, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, thanks, Shane. Yeah, I'll just add that it is a tremendous amount of effort. Like, for example, out of our native plant nursery at Rancho Sierra Vista, Satwiwa in Newbury Park, if you asked us 5 years ago how to do this, we would have, you know, a similar answer. We were, you know, we'd have to, you know, get a lot of our seeds from other institutions. But now, ever since our our native plant nursery manager, Antonio Sanchez, came on board, and Joey Algiers in leading that crew. Just a tremendous outpouring of volunteers has really fueled our seed collection efforts. We couldn't do nearly as much without just, you know, dozens of interns, literally dozens of interns. I could probably say 100 volunteers just coming into our native plant nursery. So I just want to put the plug in again. If any folks want to do hands-on meaningful work, we could use all the help at our native plant nursery: seed cleaning, seed collecting, pressing herbarium samples, all of it. It's really cool work and important work. So yeah, just watering, bumping up plants, so propagating plants in our nursery. It's all, come on over. Send me an email, please.
Yeah, I'll echo that. It's, you know, for our restoration project, I grew out all those plants myself too, and it is an insane amount of work. And I think that, and like Josie said, oftentimes the species you want aren't available for purchase from nurseries, or the seeds aren't really easily available, or there's restrictions. If it's Forest Service land, or whoever the owner of the land is, they might have restrictions on local seed source and what defines local, and that can all make it that much harder. And then there's the question of, we've been working out in Pirate for 5 years now, and 4 of those 5 years have been drought years. And then it's like, you don't know if it's going to be a drought year until the winter is happening. And so at what point do you decide to plant and hope for rain, or hold off for a year? And we've made decisions both ways. And it can be pretty tragic, but all of that time and effort into growing those plants and then putting them in the ground, and then it's all of a sudden a drought year. And I know I saw earlier a question about seedlings being a lot more cost and labor intensive, and how seeding would be a lot more ideal. And I agree, and there's like potential for a lot of these species need fire cues to germinate, and so we could potentially use prescribed burning to stimulate seed banks. But then there's the same question of, if the seedlings that we're planting and they have a head start can't survive with these drought years, then your seedlings that you're stimulating germination for aren't. And so where do you get the seed source to direct seed? And then again, when do you make the decision call of stimulating with a prescribed burn or whatnot to activate that seed bank? And then are you going to have a decent year? It's going to allow them to germinate and survive, or is it just going to be a lot of effort and money wasted because of drought? And so it's complex. There's a lot of things to consider. But I think that's the role for all the research that we've all discussed, of answering these questions on smaller scales. So when the actual practitioners go in to do large scale projects, they hopefully have a little more guidance.
We have two last quick questions before we get going, and they're both for Mo. One was in the chat. Do you ever transplant fish, or is it all about letting them come in from the ocean on their own? And then also, if fire or debris flows affect riparian vegetation, do you think it's better to let it recover naturally, or to do a lot of replanting of riparian species?
Thanks for the questions. I'll take Carla's questions first regarding transplanting. We do not transplant any fish. There's been a lot of talk about, and there's been a lot of theory as well about transplanting fish, with the Department of Fish and Wildlife having hatcheries, but they haven't been releasing fish into our local streams in a while. But people have started talking about, is it possible to start moving fish around from one watershed to a different watershed, especially after they've had such a catastrophic impact of a fire and followed debris flow, where fish might be completely extirpated from a watershed. So I think that topic's going to be coming up more and more as things get more and more dire for the fish. I certainly would like to see more fish in some of the systems, and the number of fish that are currently in some of our local streams, is very low. And so I think it would be prudent for the agencies to start working with the community that wants to see more fish in the streams and have a stronger chance of recovery across the region. To Scott's question about replanting, I think there's room for letting things recover naturally, as well as doing some planting of different species. Some of them are much slower to grow and establish themselves on their own. Others are easily added to in order to speed things up. So depending on the setting and situation, I think it's appropriate to look at both options.
Can I follow up on your transplanting fish issue? Do you
Sure.
People in the fishing, I don't know who does it, NOAA, whoever, have a feeling for how many of these steelhead there are out in the ocean, like waiting for the right year to head up a stream? And do fish make a decision, like they start up the stream when there's heavy flow in the winter and they can't find a pool and they turn around and go back? I mean, I don't know anything about these fish. Do they do that?
It's a good question, and maybe we could talk at more length over a glass of wine or beer sometime. But I think a lot of it is unknown. There's a lot of unknowns about what the fish are thinking or what they're doing, and how many are out there. You know, there's estimates that are out in the literature about potentially how many fish are in the ocean from the assumed numbers or assumed numbers from decades ago, before structures like Bradbury Dam went in place and things like that, where people are saying maybe there's 1% of that original population, but it's really unknown. And I think the population keeps decreasing as well as watersheds basically start getting X's over them. For example, in our region here, Rincon Creek doesn't have any fish in it. And my understanding of it is, talking with the local ranchers and community here, that after the fire happened in, I think it was 69, I think it was a coyote fire, if I remember correctly. There were fish prior to that. And then after that, the fish never came back because there were barriers downstream, including the Caltrans barrier that prevented fish from recolonizing the watershed. And so there's no fish. But yeah, good questions. And I think I'd love to chat more about those with you and get your input on from a different perspective on some of this as well. And I know Scott Cooper is great about answering questions like this too, so we can invite him for a beer.
Okay, everybody. Well, we've gone over just a little bit, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time and just really grateful for all of our speakers here today. Thank you so very much for lending your brains and your time and the great discussion. And thanks everyone for tuning in and asking great questions. I really thought they were wonderful. So let's all keep up the good work.
Thank you everyone who attended, and all you panelists, and for a great time in the garden, for hosting this and for honoring me with this award.